In the heart of Eagle's Rest, a tranquil farming community where neighborly chats and early morning roosters set the pace, one man's unassuming life was about to collide with a ruthless outlaw gang. James Cooper was known to most folks as the friendly, overweight farmer who sold fresh produce at the local market. But what the notorious Storm Riders motorcycle gang failed to realize was that behind James's gentle smile and extra pounds lay the lethal training of a retired Delta Force commander. What began as routine harassment over a few battered crates of tomatoes would soon expose one of the largest weapons trafficking operations in American history. As tensions escalate and the Storm Riders tighten their grip on Eagle's Rest, James must choose between preserving his peaceful new life or using the very skills he hoped to leave behind. This is a story of quiet mornings turned dangerous, of a small town rallying together against overwhelming odds, and of the one man capable of tipping the scales. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. James Cooper awoke to the soft buzz of his alarm clock at 4:30 in the morning, just as he did every day. His hands, large and calloused from years of farm labor, carefully silenced the alarm before it could ring a second time. Rising early was second nature to him. Long before he had tried his hand at taming the fields around his small homestead, James had lived by an even stricter schedule, one dictated by military operations under the cover of darkness. But those years were long gone, and he had every intention of leaving them firmly in the past. He stretched, groaning slightly as his lower back twinged. Since leaving the Army's Delta Force 8 years ago, James had put on close to 60 extra pounds. Some of it was stress, some of it was letting go, and some of it was simply enjoying life after having spent so much of it in tense, far-flung corners of the world. At 44, he now found himself a bit heavier and slower, but he was also content in ways he had never expected. He had a cozy farmhouse in Eagle's Rest, a small rural town with a population just over 4,000. The people here were neighborly, the farmland was fertile, and the local market provided a modest livelihood. Though the day promised to be quiet, the Eagle's Rest Farmers Market was always a highlight of his week. He enjoyed the hum of conversation, the warm smiles passed between neighbors, and the chance to sell the produce he'd grown with his own hands. Today, he'd be bringing in baskets of tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and a small selection of his homemade jams. His orchard wasn't large, but it provided apples he turned into preserves, which sold decently among the locals. He rolled out of bed slowly, taking a moment to look around his simple bedroom. The walls were decorated with pictures of farmland and a single framed photograph from his military days. A group shot of his former Delta Force unit, all of them armed to the teeth and sporting wild, triumphant grins. James's younger face was in the back, overshadowed by men who were all muscle, grit, and camaraderie. The photo was a reminder. If things had gone differently, if he hadn't grown so disillusioned with the constant violence and heartbreak, he might still be out there in the world, fighting battles that seemed never to end. He dressed in his usual outfit: faded jeans, a thick belt, and a loose-fitting flannel shirt that hid his bulky midsection. After lacing up his sturdy boots, he ambled to the kitchen. The coffee machine hissed and gurgled, filling the room with a rich aroma that made him smile. He poured himself a mug and went to the pantry, retrieving a small, well-worn wooden box. Inside the box was a patch embroidered with a black dagger, a memento of his Delta Force days. He placed it carefully aside, shut the box, and sighed. The patch always reminded him that the man he had been would never truly fade away, no matter how many quiet mornings he spent tending vegetables. Stepping out onto the porch with his coffee, he let the cool morning air wash over him. The horizon glowed faintly, still painted with the soft hues of night's end. He glanced out at his land, a few acres of farmland where the soil had finally come into its own after years of careful cultivation. Over in the corner was his small barn, the door left slightly ajar. His old pickup truck was parked near the barn, loaded with crates of produce. That's where his day would really begin. By 5:30, James was on the road. The old pickup rattled gently, each bump in the pavement a subtle reminder of its age. He kept the radio off, preferring the sound of the country morning. A distant rooster crowing, the hum of insects, and the rustle of trees in the wind. As he drove toward the center of Eagle's Rest, he mentally tallied the chores for the rest of the day. Feed the chickens, repair a bit of fencing near the orchard, and maybe get to the leaky faucet in the kitchen if he had time. His life here was simple and peaceful, a stark contrast to his old one. The Eagle's Rest Farmers Market occupied a large parking lot next to the community center. Every Saturday, vendors rolled in with their trucks, vans, and cars, setting up stalls beneath pop-up canopies. Fresh produce, homemade crafts, local honey, and baked goods were all in abundance. James usually arrived early, but so did many of the others. He appreciated the sense of community they all fostered. Everyone knew each other by name or at least by face. This morning, the sky had fully brightened by the time James parked and started unloading his crates of tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and jars of jam. He greeted a few familiar faces. Helen, a middle-aged woman with a passion for crocheted scarves, waved him over before he had even finished opening the truck's tailgate. "Mornin', James," she called out, her curly hair bouncing as she waved. "I heard you've got some of those apple preserves today. Set a jar aside for me, would you?" "Sure thing, Helen," he replied with an easy grin. "I've got plenty. Don't worry." As he hauled the crates to his assigned stall, he briefly inhaled the mingled scents of homemade bread, goat cheese, and freshly cut flowers from various other tables. A sense of peace settled over him, the same sense he felt every weekend. This was the life he had dreamed of when he'd left the military, though back then he'd never been quite sure how it would work out. He was about to start setting up his display when he heard the roar of motorcycle engines in the distance. He looked up, noticing the sleek shapes of several motorcycles approaching. They were still a ways off, but the noise was unmistakable, loud, powerful, and somewhat ominous. Usually, they'd pass on through to the next town or take a scenic ride. Motorcycles weren't unusual on these roads, but something about this group felt different. People in the market began to notice as well, heads turning curiously. The motorcycles turned into the lot one by one. Each rider wore a black leather vest with a crest on the back, a snarling skull with storm clouds and the words, "Storm Riders." James had heard the name around town before. They were an outlaw biker gang that had begun frequenting rural highways, and their reputation wasn't good. Drug running, intimidation, illegal arms deals. Rumors were aplenty, though no one in Eagle's Rest had seen them cause direct trouble yet. Still, their appearance set a noticeable tension over the farmers' market. 5 of them dismounted, each moving with a certain swagger. Their presence was an immediate intrusion on the local, friendly air. A hush fell across some of the vendors. James tried to shake off a sense of unease. He reminded himself that he was just a farmer here, and they likely wouldn't cause trouble if unprovoked. So he went back to placing vegetables on the table, hoping they'd just buy a bottle of water or some snacks and move on. But then came the laughter, coarse and mocking. One of the bikers, a tall, lean man with a chain dangling from his belt, elbowed another who had tattoos running up his arms. They looked right at James, and the taller one nudged his buddy, inclining his head in James's direction. "Yo, check out the big boy," he said, loud enough for James and half the market to hear. "Looks like he ate a whole hog for breakfast." James exhaled slowly through his nose. It wasn't the first time he'd been teased about his weight, and it wouldn't be the last. In the distant past, he might have snapped back with a biting remark, but that was his younger self. He wanted no part in a confrontation. He simply nodded politely and continued arranging his vegetables. Another of the bikers, who had a distinctive spiderweb tattoo on his left temple, spat on the pavement and wandered closer. "Hey, Porky," he said, picking up one of James's tomatoes from the table. He didn't bother to pay or even ask. "This fresh?" James forced a polite smile. "Yes, sir. Picked yesterday evening." The man turned it over in his hand, sniffed it, and then lobbed it up into the air, catching it with a sneer. "I'm not sure I trust a pig farmer." "I'm not a pig farmer," James interjected, though he tried to keep the edge out of his voice. "I grow produce." "Oh, you talk back now?" the man said, face twisting into a smirk. "You got a problem with me, big boy?" For a second, James felt his old instincts flare up. That part of him that had faced down insurgents, that had disarmed bombs, that had led covert raids in the dead of night, it threatened to surface. But he needed to stay calm. Engaging them in a fight was the last thing he wanted. This was exactly the kind of trouble he had uprooted his life to avoid. "No problem," James said simply, forcing a warm, neighborly tone. "I'm just here to sell my produce." The tall biker from before snickered. "Oh, you hear that, fellas? He's just here to sell his produce." He leaned in closer. "Let me guess. Overalls at home, a whole patch of farmland that's about to get repossessed, and a nice stash of Twinkies for lunch." James bit his tongue to keep from responding. A few onlookers were starting to gather, eyes darting nervously. The last thing this quiet town needed was a brawl, but by the looks of it, these men thrived on intimidation. Helen, from her booth nearby, made a move as if to step forward and say something. James gently shook his head at her, giving a small signal not to escalate. He could handle himself, though he hoped he wouldn't have to. For now, the bikers seemed content to hurl insults. The one with the spiderweb tattoo still held the tomato, tossing it up and down with a threatening casualness. Finally, he squeezed it in his fist, letting the juices drip onto the pavement. The sight made James tighten his jaw. Fresh produce was a labor of love, each tomato requiring months of effort. Tilled soil, watered seeds, careful harvesting. Yet, he refrained from letting his anger show too strongly on his face. "Whoops," the man said mockingly. "Slipped." Without responding, James moved to pick up a rag to clean the pavement. Instead, the biker flung the mashed remains into James's crate of cucumbers, splattering them with pulp. A couple of the onlookers gasped. "Guess they're all garbage anyway." The biker sneered, and his friends laughed. "You got anything worth buying? Or should we move on?" James calmly took another rag and began wiping the produce as best he could. Inside, he was calculating, measuring the situation. 5 of them, each likely armed with at least a switchblade, possibly firearms. He had no desire to get into a gunfight in the middle of the farmer's market. He also knew that if he snapped, these men would get a rude awakening about who they were really messing with. But that would mean exposing himself, calling attention to the part of him he kept carefully hidden. He stood upright. The morning sun cast a faint halo around his broad frame. He met the biker's gaze and spoke, voice low and calm. "I'd appreciate it if you left my stall alone." "And if we don't?" the tall one asked, stepping in close, nearly chest to chest with James. "What are you going to do about it, big boy?" For a heartbeat, tension gripped the air. James said nothing. He merely looked back, expression unreadable. He could see the faint glimmer of uncertainty in the biker's eyes. Bullies always tested the waters. They wanted to see if the target was truly weak or might fight back. James was not about to provoke an escalation, but he refused to show fear either. Finally, the tall biker let out a derisive laugh and backed off a step. "Not worth my time," he said, turning to the others. "Let's see what else is here." They moved on, harassing a few other vendors with rude remarks about prices, or about the quality of homemade knit items. Still, they kept glancing back at James as if waiting to see if he'd follow or cower behind his stall. He did neither. He continued tidying up his stand, writing any overturned produce, and ignoring the stares of the crowd. Eventually, after about 10 minutes of loitering, the 5 bikers mounted their motorcycles. Engines snarled, and they revved them loudly in the lot, making a spectacle. One of them spat on the ground in James's direction, but they did nothing more. A collective sigh of relief passed through the market as they finally rumbled away. Helen rushed over, eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" James nodded. "Fine," he said. "A bit of a mess to clean up, that's all." "That was so awful," she continued, voice trembling. "They had no right to treat you that way. We should call the sheriff." James took a slow breath. "I don't think it'd help much. The sheriff's got his hands full, and those men were just passing through. I hope." Helen pursed her lips but nodded. Still, that was scary. Never seen anything like it here. James gave her a reassuring look, though inside he was uneasy. He'd been in countless dangerous situations, but that had been in far-off lands under circumstances he'd prepared for. Here, in his tranquil home, it felt all the more disconcerting to see violence or the threat of it. For the next few hours, James sold his produce, made friendly conversation with the locals, and tried to shake off the altercation. Yet he couldn't deny a sense of foreboding. Something about those bikers had felt off, like a predator marking potential prey. He prayed it had been a one-off incident. But in a quiet corner of his mind, a voice from his past whispered a warning. Trouble sometimes rears its head where you least expect it, and as James Cooper would soon discover, the events of that morning were merely the spark igniting a much larger blaze, one that threatened to engulf not only Eagle's Rest, but the entire region. He finished up for the day, loaded his half-empty crates back into his truck, and nodded goodbye to the other vendors. Behind his friendly smile and gentle words, his old instincts were stirring. He was prepared, if necessary, to defend this new life he had built for himself. But he never imagined how far that defense might have to go. Little did he know the wheels were already in motion. The storm riders weren't just passing through. They were feeling out the territory, and they had just marked James Cooper as a potential target or a potential threat. That night, after returning from the market, James set about his usual chores. He scattered feed for his chickens, made sure the gates were secure, and checked on the orchard. The confrontation with the storm riders lingered in his mind, but he tried to distract himself with the tangible tasks that filled his daily routine. He tried not to dwell on the tension in the air, but after a lifetime spent in special operations, he had developed an acute sense for when things weren't right. The storm riders' arrival felt like a scouting mission. Their sneers and laughs might have been casual cruelty, but the repeated way they scanned the area hinted at a deeper purpose. Once he had finished the tasks, James retreated to his small workshop. Sturdy shelves lined the walls, each containing tools, spare parts, and the occasional jar of nails or screws. In a locked cabinet in the corner, he kept the only firearms he still owned: a hunting rifle and a shotgun. He wasn't a gun enthusiast by local standards, though he was certainly skilled enough. His time in Delta Force had taught him more about firearms than most civilians ever learned in a lifetime. But he had sworn off carrying around the heavy weaponry of his past. It was part of his effort to let go of that world. He opened the cabinet and checked the shotgun. The metal gleamed under the workshop's single overhead bulb. He made sure it was unloaded, then inspected the mechanism, each motion of his hands practiced with the ease of muscle memory. Just in case, he thought to himself. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a habit of finding him. After placing the shotgun back and locking the cabinet, he sighed and shut the workshop door. The sun was setting over his orchard, bathing the trees in gold and pink. He felt a pang of nostalgia, a recollection of sunsets in faraway places, mountainous war zones, deserts that stretched out for miles, deep jungles and hidden bases that only a handful of people knew existed. In the army, he had seen the world. Now he barely left Eagle's Rest. He settled inside his house for the evening, cooking a simple dinner of mashed potatoes, grilled chicken, and green beans from his garden. He ate in silence, flipping through a book about orchard management. The uneasy feeling remained, like a subtle itch he couldn't scratch. He tried distracting himself with the lines of text about pest control, irrigation methods, and pruning techniques. Eventually, he grew tired enough that he decided to call it a night. But as he began to drift off in his bed, an unwelcome memory surfaced. The face of his Delta Force commander during their last mission together. The look of cold resignation in his eyes as he gave the order that changed everything. James pushed the memory away, trying to bury it deep again. He hadn't left the military on bad terms exactly, but he had walked away with regrets he'd never shared with anyone. Every now and then, the ghosts of that life surfaced, especially when potential violence threatened to invade his new existence. Sleep came slowly, fitful and marred by disjointed dreams. He woke up once in the middle of the night, sweating despite the cool breeze that wafted in through the open window. For a moment, he thought he heard motorcycles in the distance. But it was just his imagination. He turned over and drifted off once more. The next morning, Sunday, he decided to visit the local diner, Millie's, to catch up on any gossip. Eagle's Rest might have been small, but the diner was the nerve center of local chatter. If the storm riders had made any impact, word would spread there. By 7:30, James was seated at the counter, sipping a cup of strong coffee and waiting on a stack of pancakes. Millie, the owner and namesake, was a kindly woman in her late 50s. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled into a tight bun, and she wore a cheerful floral apron. She greeted him with a smile. "Morning, James. Heard something stirred up the farmer's market yesterday." James nodded, not surprised that the news traveled fast. A group of bikers caused a bit of trouble. "Nothing major." Millie frowned. "I heard they were some outlaw gang. My niece said she saw them revving their engines, harassing folks." "Sounds about right," James replied, sipping his coffee thoughtfully. "I swear, this town has enough excitement once the carnival comes around in the summer. We don't need ruffians passing through," Millie said, shaking her head. "Well, here's your pancakes." She set the plate down in front of him. The comforting aroma of butter and syrup filled the air. James ate in relative silence, occasionally glancing around. A few farmers and ranchers he recognized were sprinkled at various tables, reading the local paper or chatting amongst themselves. One older gentleman, Cole Watkins, approached him as he was finishing his meal. "James," Cole greeted, taking a seat on the stool beside him uninvited. He had a folded newspaper in his hands. "You got a second?" James wiped his mouth with a napkin. "Sure, Cole. What's up?" Leaning in, Cole whispered, "Heard from my nephew who works over at the County Line gas station. Says the same group of bikers rode in there last night around midnight. Caused some damage, threatened the clerk. They left without paying for gas or supplies." James's eyes darkened. "Any injuries?" "No, but my nephew was mighty shaken. He said they were talking about transport routes and drop points. Didn't make much sense to him, but it sounded illegal. He tried to call the sheriff, but by the time deputies arrived, they were gone." James considered the information. This was more than just a rowdy gang. He'd suspected as much. If they were talking about transport routes and drop points, it might mean weapons, drugs, or something else. "Sorry to hear that," James said, not entirely sure how to respond without betraying too much of his own knowledge. "I hope your nephew's all right." Cole nodded. "Just a bit jumpy is all. But I've got a bad feeling about these fellas. James pressed his lips into a thin line. So do I. They parted ways, and James left a generous tip for Millie before stepping outside. The sun was already high, promising a warm day. He lingered by his truck, scanning the streets. Everything was calm, yet the tension he'd felt the previous day wouldn't vanish. It weighed on him like a damp, heavy blanket. Part of him wanted to march straight to the sheriff's office and volunteer whatever help he could offer, but that would lead to questions. Questions about why he knew so much about infiltration tactics and clandestine operations. He wasn't ready to answer those questions. He climbed into his truck and pulled out of the diner parking lot, heading home. Just as he turned onto the main road, he spotted an unfamiliar sight. Two men on motorcycles parked outside a small hardware store, both wearing leather vests that read, "Storm Riders." They were just talking, but the presence of two bikers from that gang in broad daylight in Eagle's Rest was new. Yesterday, it had been 5 men at the market. Now there were 2 more here, or possibly the same men minus some members or different combinations. Regardless, it didn't feel random anymore. It felt like they were establishing a presence. James kept driving, not wanting to provoke anything. But inside, his mind was turning. If these bikers were part of a larger operation, it wouldn't be long before the entire town felt the consequences. In his years of service, he'd learned that well-structured criminal outfits often tested small communities first, gauging the law enforcement response. If they sensed weakness, they dug in like ticks. He arrived home, intending to get more done around the farm to distract himself. But the focus simply wasn't there. He fed the chickens, hoed the weeds around his tomato plants, and tried to plan for next week's market. Every time he paused, though, his thoughts circled back to the Storm Riders. A memory emerged of a mission in Afghanistan. They had encountered local insurgents in a small village, men who initially seemed like no more than petty criminals. But it turned out they were the forward team of a larger organization, setting the stage for the transport of stolen weapons. The similarity between that scenario and this one niggled at him. He wasn't the same man he'd been back then, but the instincts were as sharp as ever. He felt the unstoppable gears of fate grinding into motion. As night fell, he found himself back in his workshop, eyeing the locked gun cabinet again. He moved past it to a dusty trunk in the corner, one he hadn't opened in a long time. The trunk contained more personal mementos from his military days. Old uniforms, tactical gear, a battered knife he'd carried through countless missions. He almost lifted the lid, but stopped himself. If he opened that trunk, if he slipped even slightly back into that mindset, there'd be no going back. Still, he rested a hand on the trunk's top, his heart pounding. Part of him felt that inevitable pull. Then his phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. It was a local number. "Hello?" he answered. "Mr. Cooper?" It was a voice he recognized as belonging to Sheriff Thompson. "Hope I'm not calling too late." James glanced at the clock. 8:45 p.m. Not terribly late, but unexpected. "Not at all, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" "Well," the sheriff said, exhaling audibly into the receiver, "I heard about the incident at the farmer's market yesterday. I'm making some rounds, seeing if folks have any details. I know those bikers got rowdy. You see anything that might help us?" James leaned against the trunk, recalling the details. "They harassed some vendors, me included, smashed some produce, threw around insults. Nothing worse. They left after maybe 10 minutes. That all?" the sheriff asked, skepticism lacing his tone. "That's all I saw," James replied. "I heard they might have gone over to the County Line gas station later that night, too." The sheriff grunted. "Yep, they did. And we got a report they were spotted around the old Westbridge warehouse. Something about them snooping around. Probably nothing, but I got a funny feeling about these guys. Might just be an outlaw gang passing through, or might be something more. James felt his pulse quicken. The Westbridge warehouse had been abandoned for years. It was an ideal spot for illicit activities, remote, large, and seldom visited. "Let me know if I can help," he said carefully. "I might just do that," the sheriff responded. "But I'll try not to trouble you unless there's good reason." "Thank you, James." James hung up, mind racing. If the storm riders were truly investigating the Westbridge warehouse, it meant they could be looking for a stash site or a distribution hub. He cursed under his breath. He had come to Eagle's Rest to live a peaceful life, and now it felt like the vestiges of his old one were threatening to intrude. He walked to the living room and stared at the photograph of his old unit. It was taken in a dusty foreign landscape, each man in the picture looking battle-hardened but triumphant. He remembered how unstoppable they'd felt. But James had left that behind in favor of growing tomatoes and apples, a life of quiet honesty. Yet a line of thought formed in the back of his mind. If the storm riders were indeed part of a bigger operation, ignoring them might be the worst move. If no one else in Eagle's Rest could stand up to them, if the local sheriff department couldn't match their reach, then maybe James's old skill set would be needed after all. But was he willing to pick up that cross again? He shook his head, turning off the living room lights before heading to bed. The question simmered without an immediate answer. As he drifted off, the memories and realities swirled in a restless churn behind his closed eyes. Tomorrow, he told himself, I'll see what happens. Maybe they'll move on. But deep down, he knew that was wishful thinking. Monday morning dawned with a crisp chill in the air. James woke early, completed his usual chores, and did his best to adopt his standard routine. Yet the sense of normalcy that had once colored his every step felt shaky. By mid-morning, he decided to drive into town again to pick up some supplies. He needed new fence posts to repair a section of his property line, and the local hardware store had the best prices. Pulling up, he noticed the parking lot was busier than usual. The reason became clear as soon as he spotted the police cruiser parked by the curb and two deputies standing outside the store, talking in hushed tones. James climbed out of his truck, trying not to appear too interested in their conversation. He offered a polite nod as he headed inside. The store was well lit and lined with rows of neatly organized tools, lumber, and various farm supplies. At the front counter stood Frank, the hardware store owner, looking agitated. A short, balding man of around 50, he was gesticulating wildly as he spoke to one of the deputies who had just come inside. "I tell you, they came in here like they owned the place," Frank exclaimed. "Snapped at me, said they'd pay but only if I cut the price in half. Like I run some kind of charity." "They threatened you?" asked the deputy, whose badge read Hargrave. "Felt like it," Frank huffed. "They didn't wave a gun around, but the way they carried themselves, I'd rather just lose a sale than provoke 'em. So I told them to take what they wanted and leave. Didn't even ring him up." James's brow furrowed. Another instance of intimidation. So the storm riders were making their presence known. He stood quietly in an aisle with fence posts, listening carefully. Suddenly, Frank spotted him. "Oh, James," he called over. "You were at the market the other day, weren't you? Did you see the same guys?" James nodded, stepping toward the counter. "I saw some. It might have been them." Deputy Hargrave turned to him. "Morning, Mr. Cooper. Heard you had a run-in with these bikers, too." James shrugged. "They made a scene, but no one was hurt." The deputy made a note on a small notepad. "Okay, well, we'll file a report. Thanks for your time, Frank." He looked to James. "Can I talk to you outside for a moment?" James nodded, following the deputy back out into the morning sun. The other deputy gave them space, keeping an eye on the passing cars. "How long you been in town, James?" Hargrave asked. "About 8 years," James replied, wondering where this was going. Hargrave nodded. "Folks here respect you. Never known you to cause trouble. Sheriff Thompson said you volunteered info the other night about the bikers at the market. Just wanted to see if you had anything else to add. James took a breath. Not really. They seemed to be throwing their weight around. I heard they were at the old warehouse, but that's about it. I see. Hargrave shifted his weight. Look, off the record, I'm worried. The department's small, and these guys might be bigger than we can handle if they're part of a large club. We don't know what they're up to, but it's not good. You ever see them do anything that indicated they might have heavy weaponry? James shook his head. Not that I saw. Mostly intimidation so far. Hargrave sighed. Well, if you get any more info or see anything suspicious, call us. We're outnumbered and outgunned if it comes to a serious confrontation. James nodded, feeling a pang of sympathy. The deputy was right. Eagle's Rest wasn't equipped to deal with a large criminal gang. I will, he promised. With that, Hargrave walked back to his cruiser, leaving James alone in the parking lot. He let out a slow exhale, then returned inside to purchase his fence posts. Once he got what he needed and paid, he helped Frank reorganize a few shelves that the bikers had apparently knocked over during their visit. The man was still shaking with a mix of anger and fear. As James loaded the supplies into his truck, he noticed a familiar black motorcycle with the Storm Rider's patch zoom by on the main road. Its rider cast a quick glance in James's direction but didn't stop. The tension in James's muscles wound tighter. Something told him these sightings would become more frequent, not less. He drove home, fixating on the new fence project to keep his hands busy and his mind from spiraling. Around midday, as he hammered a post into the ground, he realized he couldn't ignore the situation forever. If the Storm Riders were indeed setting up some kind of operation, it would escalate until the local authorities were overwhelmed or coerced into looking the other way. And James had no interest in living under the shadow of a criminal enterprise. That evening, after a hot shower, he found himself staring at his reflection in the mirror. He saw the lines around his eyes, the faint scars on his broad arms, and the extra weight around his midsection. He was no longer the lean, ruthless soldier he'd once been, but the steel inside him had never really dulled. He considered the possibility of contacting an old comrade for advice. Yet that would risk exposing his past to the entire town. He decided to take a drive instead, just to clear his head. Stepping outside, he glanced at the horizon. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and reds. He climbed into his truck and headed toward the outskirts of Eagle's Rest, where the roads wound through open fields and groves of pine trees. He found himself steering toward the old Westbridge warehouse, half out of curiosity, half out of a sense of duty. The building sat down a dirt access road, a dilapidated structure covered in graffiti and rusting corrugated metal. Weeds and brush crowded the entry, which was blocked by a rusted chain-link fence. There were no lights on, and the silence of the surrounding area pressed in. James parked some distance away, not wanting to draw attention. He cut the engine and sat there for a long moment, the cicadas providing the only soundtrack. If the bikers were using this place, they'd likely come at night. He waited, eyes scanning the darkness. For about an hour, nothing happened. Then, just as he was starting to debate leaving, he heard the faint rumble of engines. Sure enough, a pair of motorcycles glided down the dirt road, headlights off. They circled around the far side of the warehouse, out of James's line of sight. He felt his adrenaline spike. This was definitely more than just passing through. They were being secretive. Another bike arrived a few minutes later, repeating the same route. They were all going somewhere behind the building. Cautiously, James turned off the truck's interior lights and cracked the door open just enough to slide out. He moved on foot, sticking close to the treeline for cover. Even with the extra weight on his frame, he knew how to move silently. It had been years, but the techniques came flooding back. Control your breathing, roll your foot from heel to toe, avoid stepping on branches. He made his way around the perimeter until he found a vantage point overlooking the building's rear. His heart pounded as he spotted 4 bikes parked near a broken loading dock door. A single utility truck was there too. A figure emerged from the warehouse, a flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. James strained his eyes, focusing on the men. Even from this distance, he could see the Storm Riders' patches on their vests. Then the flashlight illuminated several wooden crates stacked inside the building. Crates. The shape and size were oddly reminiscent of the kinds of shipping containers he'd seen in his military days, often used for transporting weapons or ammunition. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He told himself not to jump to conclusions, but his gut told him exactly what this looked like. One of the bikers pried open a crate, and in the beam of the flashlight, James caught the glint of metal. Rifles, by the look of it. He crouched there, instinct screaming. This was bigger than small-time intimidation. The Storm Riders appeared to be handling illegal weapons. If that was true, then Eagle's Rest was about to become the hub of a serious criminal network, possibly the largest in the region. James's mind raced with possibilities. He didn't have the equipment or the backup to intervene. If he just called the sheriff, the Storm Riders might vanish before help arrived, or worse, ambush the deputies. No, he needed hard evidence, and he needed a strategy. It wasn't his fight, he reminded himself. He had left that life behind, but every fiber of his being argued otherwise. He remembered small communities in foreign countries ravaged by armed groups because no one stood up in time. If the Storm Riders weren't stopped, they'd bring terror right to the doorstep of innocent families in Eagle's Rest. He watched as the men closed the crates and loaded them onto the utility truck. After several tense minutes, the group rode off in a coordinated manner. 2 bikes led, the truck followed, and another pair of bikes brought up the rear. They sped away into the night, dust kicking up under their tires. James waited another 5 minutes to ensure they were gone, then approached the warehouse. The building's interior was dark, but he had a small flashlight in his glove compartment. He retrieved it and slipped inside through the half-broken loading dock door. The smell of dust and rust assaulted his nose. The floor was littered with broken glass, trash, and older crates. A row of fresh impressions on the ground revealed where the newly loaded crates had been. He knelt, tracing a finger along a deep scratch mark. This was definitely recent. A distant drip of water echoed in the cavernous interior. He explored the space with quiet steps, the beam of the flashlight darting around. Most of the building was empty, except for a corner filled with more crates. Carefully, he pried open one corner of a crate using a piece of scrap metal from the floor. A breath caught in his throat. Dozens of black steel rifles, still coated in protective grease. This wasn't just a few guns for personal use. This was an arsenal capable of arming a small army. His mind spun. Where had they come from? Was the Storm Riders gang merely storing them, or were they part of the trafficking pipeline? Either way, it was a major operation, and James had stumbled right into it. He knew he had to step carefully. If the bikers realized he'd been snooping, he'd become a target. Or worse, they might accelerate their plans, scattering the weapons across the state before law enforcement could intervene. He quietly closed the crate. Adrenaline fueled his every movement as he made his way out of the warehouse. Carefully, he ensured no trace of his presence remained. Slipping back to his truck, he half expected to find the bikers waiting for him. But the clearing was empty. As he drove home, he grappled with the magnitude of what he'd uncovered. This was the kind of high-stakes scenario that in his old life would have warranted a specialized task force. A hush-hush infiltration, leading to a swift takedown. But Eagle's Rest had none of that. They had a handful of deputies and a sheriff who was probably not equipped for anything close to this level of threat. The nearest big city SWAT team or ATF branch was hours away. James parked in front of his farmhouse, heart still hammering in his chest. He sat in the truck, breathing heavily, mind reeling with the potential fallout. Then he recalled the look in the biker's eyes at the market. Arrogance, a sense of invulnerability. They knew they had the upper hand in this small community. He stepped out, gazing at his quiet farmhouse under the moonlight. The silhouette of his orchard spread out behind it. This was his sanctuary, and he wasn't about to let it become ground zero for a criminal empire. But what could he do? Was he willing to cross that line and become the soldier again, the one who planned covert strikes and took out threats before they grew out of control? It felt as though two parts of himself battled for supremacy. The farmer who just wanted a simple life and the Delta Force operator who recognized evil and knew how to stop it. The question was no longer if he would get involved, but how. If he stood idly by, the entire town could suffer. Finally, he trudged inside, locked every door and window, and collapsed into his recliner. Sleep was far from his mind. The old photograph of his unit caught his eye again. One of his closest buddies, Brandon Ellis, had gone on to work with the ATF after leaving the Army. James wondered if he still had Brandon's contact information. Perhaps that would be a first step. Maybe he could pass on the intel quietly, let the professionals handle this. But part of him knew how these operations worked. They moved fast when they had to, and if the bureaucracy was slow or the storm riders got wind, everything could fall apart. There was also no guarantee Brandon was still with the ATF, or that he could mobilize resources in time. James stared out the window at the moonlit fields, torn between the life he'd chosen and the life that refused to let go. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. This was bigger than just him. Innocent people were at stake. People like Helen at the farmer's market, Frank at the hardware store, Millie at the diner. Good folks who deserved safety and peace. He couldn't just walk away. Decision made, he rose and headed for his workshop. Once inside, he opened the locked cabinet again. This time, he took out the shotgun, checking its parts with cold efficiency. Then he knelt by the trunk in the corner, and for the first time in years, he opened it. Inside lay the remnants of a former life. Tactical gear, a sidearm he'd kept for emergencies, and a sheathed combat knife. As he looked over each piece, an old, familiar certainty filled him, as though a missing piece of his identity were snapping back into place. He would protect Eagle's Rest no matter the cost. Yet, as he stared at the gear, a single grim thought haunted him. Once he took up these tools again, there was no telling how far he'd have to go, or if he'd ever truly put them down. The following morning, James woke to a cloudy sky that matched the heaviness in his mind. He mechanically went through his chores, feeding the chickens, tending to the vegetables, and checking on the orchard. But the sense of dread lay over his farm like a storm cloud on the verge of bursting. He decided his first step would be to discreetly gather information. With that in mind, he got in his truck and drove into town. He planned to see if the sheriff had learned anything new. On his way, he passed a group of 3 motorcycles pulled off to the side of the road, their riders talking. His heart thumped when he recognized the storm riders' patches. One of them turned to look at his truck passing by. James didn't slow down. At the sheriff's office, a small single-story brick building with an American flag out front, James parked and walked in. The receptionist, a young deputy he didn't recognize well, greeted him politely. "I'd like to speak with Sheriff Thompson if he's available," James said. "He's in his office," the deputy replied. "Down the hall, first door on the right." James thanked him, his footsteps echoing on the worn linoleum. He found the door marked Sheriff and knocked lightly. "Come in," came the sheriff's voice. Sheriff Thompson looked up from his cluttered desk, removing a pair of reading glasses. He was a man in his early 50s, lean and with graying hair at the temples. Though he carried the usual small-town sheriff air of friendliness, there was a sternness in his hazel eyes. "James," he said, gesturing for him to sit. "What brings you by?" James closed the door behind him. "I'm worried about those bikers, Sheriff. I've been hearing things, and I think they're planning to stay in town longer than we'd like." Thompson sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I am too. We're getting more and more complaints. Vandalism, threats, suspicious activity. Problem is, we haven't caught them in any act that would let us make arrests that stick. And if they're as dangerous as rumors suggest, I need to be careful sending my deputies into the fray without backup." James nodded, carefully choosing his words. "Would the state police or federal agencies be able to help?" "In theory, yes," Thompson said grimly. "But we've made some calls. State police have their hands full, and unless we can prove these guys are involved in major interstate crimes, the feds won't mobilize quickly. They need more concrete evidence." The tension in James's shoulders intensified. He knew exactly how this played out. By the time concrete evidence was obtained, the Storm Riders would be firmly entrenched or have moved their operation out of sight. "Sheriff," James ventured, "what if I said they're dealing in weapons? Big shipments of them, hidden in the old Westbridge warehouse." Thompson's eyes widened. "You have proof?" James hesitated, aware he was taking a risk. "I saw some crates there, full of rifles. The gang was loading them into a truck." Thompson stood abruptly, walking to shut the door fully. "You realize what you're saying, James? If that's true, we're dealing with a significant gun-running operation. The kind that could bring the ATF down on them, if we can prove it." "I know." James's voice was low but steady. "But they're being careful. They move them at night, and it seems like they've already moved a big part of the shipment." Thompson raked a hand through his hair. "Damn, this is bigger than I feared. I'll call the state police again. See if they can send a detective. But we'll need something more than your testimony that you saw crates. No offense, James, but they'll want pictures, serial numbers, something more concrete." James felt the cold coil of responsibility tighten inside him. "I understand," he replied. "I just wanted to let you know." The sheriff nodded, eyes distant. "I appreciate it. Keep your head down, though. If they catch wind you've seen too much." "I can take care of myself," James interrupted, his tone firmer than intended. Thompson studied him for a moment, as though seeing him in a new light. "If you say so, but be careful. This isn't a fight any one person can win alone." James nodded once, took his leave, and exited the office. He felt a measure of relief at having shared what he knew, but also frustration. Law enforcement couldn't act until they had indisputable evidence. And by then, the Storm Riders might adapt and become even harder to dislodge. He drove away from the sheriff's office, mind spinning. Back at his farm, he parked near the barn and hopped out. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, the gray sky reflecting his mood. He noticed something amiss immediately. The door to his barn was slightly ajar. James never left it that way. He approached carefully, tension knotting in his stomach. A quiet dread whispered that he wasn't alone. He stepped inside, scanning the dim interior. Hay bales were stacked in one corner, and his tractor was parked on the far side. A shadow shifted behind the tractor. James's instincts screamed. He dipped behind the barn door frame, pressing his back to the wall. He heard a footstep, then another. "Hey, big boy," came a sneering voice, echoing in the barn. "We know you're in here somewhere." James closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. It was one of the bikers, maybe more. How had they tracked him here? Had they followed him from the sheriff's office? Or had they targeted him because he'd stood up to them at the market? "I don't see him," another voice said, lower. "Maybe he's not home. His truck's outside," the first voice replied. "He's here." James took a slow breath, grounding himself in the moment. Two men, from what he could hear, possibly armed. They had come onto his property, likely with an intention to intimidate or worse. He glanced around for anything he could use as a weapon. A pitchfork leaned against the wall. A shovel. Neither option was ideal. Then he remembered the workshop, a short sprint away. His shotgun was locked up inside. But if he made noise heading there, the men would definitely hear and might open fire. He forced himself to breathe slowly and remain calm. He carefully peered around the door. The first biker he saw had a shaved head and a large black beard. He carried a metal pipe in one hand. The second, a wiry man with a ponytail, held something that looked like a handgun. They were about 15 feet away, scanning the barn. "Let's smash some of this place up," the bearded one grunted, tapping his pipe against the tractor's metal. "Teach that fat farmer not to snitch." James's anger flared. These men had come to destroy his property and threaten him under the assumption that he might have reported something, which he had, in a way, but their real fear might be that James had seen too much. That was all the confirmation James needed. The storm riders were serious, and they viewed him as a threat to their operation. He gripped the pitchfork, carefully lifting it so the metal prongs hovered inches above the floor. One misstep and it would clank. He needed the element of surprise. The bearded man moved toward the far side of the barn. The wiry man with the handgun circled around, their backs sometimes to each other, sometimes covering angles. This wasn't random chaos. They were methodically searching. James recognized trained vigilance, or at least a practiced routine. The storm riders might be criminals, but some of them knew how to conduct a sweep. He crouched behind the stacked hay bales, waiting. When the wiry man passed by, James burst into motion. With a swift, silent step, he jabbed the pitchfork's handle into the back of the man's knee. The wiry man buckled, and his handgun wobbled. Before he could regain balance, James ripped the weapon from his grasp and tossed it aside, the metal skittering across the barn floor. "What the wiry man croaked, but James cut him off with a hard elbow strike to the jaw. The man crumpled to the ground, dazed. "Hey!" the bearded one shouted, charging forward. He swung the metal pipe in a wide arc aimed at James's head. James ducked, feeling the rush of air as the pipe hissed by mere inches away. He pivoted to plant a hard punch into the man's gut. The bearded biker staggered, but recovered quickly, swinging again. This time, James raised the pitchfork, and the pipe clanged off the metal prongs, jarring the biker's arms. James seized the moment to deliver a precise kick to the man's side, sending him stumbling into the tractor's tire. The pipe fell from his grip, clattering on the concrete floor. Eyes wide with fury, the biker lunged barehanded, aiming for James's throat. But James sidestepped smoothly, hooking an arm around the man's neck in a chokehold. The bearded man thrashed, but James tightened his grip with the practiced expertise he thought he'd forgotten. "Enough," James growled. He had the advantage easily. Yet a voice in his head reminded him that this was exactly the sort of violence he'd tried to leave behind. A single twist, a snap, and the man would be done for. But James didn't want that. His only goal was to neutralize the threat. Just then, the wiry man, who was not fully unconscious, scrambled on the floor, reaching for his gun. James saw him in his peripheral vision. He pivoted, letting the bearded biker go just enough to grab the pitchfork and fling it toward the wiry man's arm. The handle struck with enough force to knock the limb aside. The gun clattered again. The bearded biker used the moment's distraction to elbow James hard in the ribs. Pain shot through James's side, but it only fueled his adrenaline. In a swift motion, James kicked behind the biker's knees, dropping him to the floor. Before he could rise, James pinned him with a knee to the back, wrestling the man's arms behind him. Panting, James looked over at the wiry man, who was inching toward the barn exit. "Don't even think about it," James warned, voice deadly calm. The wiry man froze, eyes wide with something akin to fear and perhaps awe. He'd clearly not expected a fat farmer to handle himself like a trained operator. James glared down at the bearded biker. "Why are you here? Who sent you?" The man spat in anger. "You might think you're tough, but you messed with the wrong crew." James slammed the man's shoulder into the ground for emphasis. "Talk." A few ragged breaths later, the bearded biker snarled, "We know you've been snooping. Storm riders don't like snitches. We came to warn you." James exhaled, controlling the anger surging within him. This was confirmation that they suspected he was onto their operation. "Listen carefully," James said in a low voice. "If you come back to my property or hurt anyone in this town, I will end this." He released the bearded man, stepping back. The wiry man slowly stood, still jittery. They both stared at James, trying to assess the situation. They were on his property, overpowered, disarmed. James could call the sheriff right now and have them arrested for trespassing and assault. But even that might just escalate the war with the gang. They'd likely post bail or more members would retaliate. "Get out," James ordered, "and tell your boss that I'm not the easy mark you think I am." The wiry man staggered over to retrieve his fallen gun. James tensed, ready to strike again if he raised it. But the man scooped it up, shoving it into his waistband. He helped the bearded man to his feet. Both men glared, but they backed toward the barn exit. As they left, the bearded one barked, "This ain't over." James followed at a distance, ensuring they actually left the property. They had two bikes parked just down the dirt road near the fence, concealed by some bushes. They hopped on and roared away, leaving a cloud of dust behind. James let out a shaky breath. His side hurt where the elbow had connected, and his knuckles burned. This was a new level of brazenness. The storm riders had come onto his farm, fully prepared to harm him. That meant they'd likely come back, possibly in greater numbers. The illusions of a quiet solution were melting away. If they could be so bold, how long before they attacked other townsfolk who defied them? He returned to the barn, adrenaline slowly ebbing, and stared at the scene of scattered hay and the pipe lying on the ground. Part of him felt a chill, knowing that he'd come dangerously close to going further, too far, in fact. Yet he'd managed to hold back. He sank onto a bale of hay, feeling the ache in his bruised ribs. This was real, and it was escalating fast. The local sheriff's department didn't stand a chance against a well-armed gang, especially one that potentially had a stockpile of illegal weapons. James realized that the next move might have to be his. He couldn't just wait for them to return in greater numbers. He needed intelligence, allies, a plan. If he was going to protect Eagle's Rest, he would have to move swiftly and decisively. There were people in this town he cared about, people who could become collateral damage. And there was also the knowledge that the storm riders would likely strike him again. He rose from the bale, retrieving the pitchfork and placing it aside. Then he walked to the workshop, each step weighted by grim determination. He opened the trunk containing his old gear once more. The bulletproof vest lay folded beneath a desert camouflage jacket. His sidearm nestled in a small holster, everything he swore he'd never wear again. With trembling hands, he lifted the vest, feeling its weight. The last time he'd worn armor like this had been overseas, in a life far from the fields of Eagle's Rest. Now, it seemed that life had found him anyway. That night, the wind whipped through James's orchard, rustling the apple trees as though urging them to speak. James sat inside his farmhouse living room, a single lamp illuminating the pages of a spiral-bound notebook. He was jotting down every detail he had about the storm riders, from their patches and approximate membership numbers to the warehouse location and the times he'd observed them. When a gust of wind rattled the window, he tensed reflexively. He was wound too tight. Normally, the sound of wind in the trees was comforting, but tonight, every noise set him on edge. He'd locked up the barn and the house like a fortress, but paranoia still gnawed at him. If two of them had come by in daylight, there was no telling what they might do under cover of darkness. He flipped the page and began listing the possibilities for external help. Sheriff's Department, understaffed, outgunned, needs concrete proof. State Police, possibly slow to respond without evidence. ATF or FBI would likely only act with significant proof of interstate trafficking. James tapped the pen on the paper. He needed a more direct approach. A memory flickered of a phone number scrawled in one of his old notebooks from his Army days. Brandon Ellis, his old Delta teammate who had joined the ATF. Even if Brandon was still with them, it had been years. James set the pen down and exhaled. It might be a long shot, but it was a start. He marched upstairs to the spare room he used as a small office, rummaging through boxes until he found the right one. It was labeled Army Stuff, in black marker. Inside lay old after-action reports, letters from deployed buddies, pictures of him and his unit. The nostalgia threatened to suck him in, but he pushed on, searching for the address book. After sifting through a stack of documents, he found a folded piece of paper with a list of phone numbers. There it was, Ellis, Brandon, and a number. Adrenaline surged as he reached for his cell phone. He hesitated. What if Brandon had changed numbers? What if contacting him put them both at risk? He brushed aside those doubts. Right now, Eagle's Rest was at risk. That was bigger than fear of potential blowback. He dialed. The phone rang twice, then a recorded message. The number you have called is no longer in service. James's stomach sank. Another dead end. He hung up, leaning back in his chair. Maybe he'd search online for Brandon's name later, though James wasn't much for technology. Maybe the local library had internet access he could use discreetly. He headed back downstairs, scribbling a note to check for Brandon's updated contact info. Just then, his phone buzzed, making him jump. It was Sheriff Thompson. James grabbed the phone, heart racing. "Hello, James? Sorry to bother you this late," Thompson said, voice tight. "We got a call from the manager at the Redwood Motel on Route 7. Seems a group of bikers has taken several rooms, and they're raising hell. Some folks staying there are scared. My deputies are stretched thin tonight, so I might head over. Thought I'd see if you had any insight." James bit his lip. So they were setting up near the main highway route, close enough to town for easy access. "I don't know if I have insight," James said carefully, "but I can come keep watch if you need the help. Might discourage them from acting out if they see more people around." Pause on the line. "Officially, I can't ask you to put yourself in harm's way. But if you happen to be in the area, it couldn't hurt to have a witness," Thompson said, a hint of relief in his voice. "Understood," James replied. "I'll be there soon." He ended the call, quickly pulled on a heavier jacket, and after a moment's hesitation, grabbed his sidearm from the trunk in the workshop. He tucked the handgun into a concealed holster at his waist, something he hadn't done in years. A wave of mixed emotion roiled in his gut. Necessity overrode hesitation. He locked up the house and drove into the night. The Redwood Motel stood off Route 7 behind a row of scraggly pine trees. Its neon sign flickered in the darkness, casting eerie flashes of red light. As James pulled into the small parking lot, he spotted the sheriff's cruiser parked near the manager's office. The place looked rough around the edges, the kind of low-cost motel where travelers only stayed if they had no other option. A few dim lights in the windows indicated occupied rooms. James parked a short distance away and walked up to the cruiser. Sheriff Thompson rolled down his window. "Glad you made it," he said. "I haven't approached them yet. Just got here. And the manager inside is half scared to death." "How many are there?" James asked, scanning the rows of rooms. Manager said 4 or 5. Loud music, yelling, and they threatened to trash the place if he didn't mind his own business. James nodded. "Let's see what's going on." They approached the row of rooms, flashlights in hand. The sound of pounding rock music spilled from one of the doors, accompanied by raucous laughter. When they knocked, it took almost a minute for someone to answer. A lanky biker with greasy hair swung the door open. He wore a Storm Rider's vest and reeked of beer. "What the hell you want?" he sneered. Then he saw the sheriff's badge and James's imposing frame behind him. His expression hardened. "This is private property, man." Thompson stepped forward. "Sir, we've received noise complaints. I'm going to have to ask you to keep it down." "Noise complaints?" The biker snorted. "It's a free country. We're just having a little fun." James stayed silent, scanning the interior. 2 more bikers sat on the beds, a cloud of smoke enveloping them. Cigarettes, maybe something stronger. A half-dozen empty beer cans littered the nightstand. The tension in the air was palpable, and the music thumped so loudly that James felt the bass in his chest. Thompson repeated his request, his voice calm but firm. The lanky biker rolled his eyes. "Fine, we'll turn it down," he said. "Anything else, officer?" The sheriff glanced at James, then back to the biker. "We've had multiple complaints about storm riders causing problems in town. I'm letting you know we're watching." A gravelly laugh came from one of the men inside. "Let him watch. We're not breaking any laws, just partying in our room." James clenched his jaw. The men's casual arrogance confirmed that they believed local law enforcement had no real power over them. Still, the sheriff had to follow due process. "All right," Thompson said, stepping back. "Keep it down, or we'll have to write you a citation." The door slammed shut in their faces, muffling the music only slightly. Thompson let out a frustrated sigh. "I'll file a report," he said. "That's about all I can do right now." James nodded, stepping away from the door. "Mind if I talk to the manager?" "Go ahead," Thompson said. "I'm going to circle around back, see if there's anything suspicious." James headed to the small lobby office, where a pale, nervous man in his 40s was peering out from behind the check-in desk. "Are they done?" he asked, voice quivering. "For now," James said gently. "I'm James Cooper. Sheriff Thompson is patrolling the perimeter." "You're the manager." The man nodded, swallowing hard. "Name's Sal. These guys, they showed up earlier this evening, rented 3 rooms with cash. Seemed okay at first, but then the party started. Music, shouting, a lot of swearing. I asked them to keep it down. One of them pulled me aside and said if I stuck my nose in their business, he'd show me what a real beating looks like." Fear shone in Sal's eyes. James felt a surge of protectiveness for the innocent townspeople. "We're not going to let them hurt you," James reassured. "But do you remember anything else they mentioned? Something about a warehouse or shipments?" Sal rubbed his hands together. I heard them talking. They think this place is quiet and cheap, a good base of operations, they said. Something about meeting others tomorrow night for a delivery." Tomorrow night. James's pulse quickened. "Any idea where this meeting might happen?" Sal shook his head. "Didn't catch that, sorry. I just wanted them gone." James gave him a sympathetic nod. "You did good, Sal. Hang tight." Outside, Thompson was waiting by his cruiser. The sheriff looked resigned. "They've got bikes around back and some boxes, but I can't just bust in. No probable cause. I'm gonna stick around to make sure they stay put. You go on home, James." James considered telling Thompson what Sal had said, but with no specifics on the location or the time of the meeting, it wouldn't help much legally. He did mention the rumor of a meeting the next evening, though. Thompson frowned. I'll see what I can find out. Maybe have some deputies keep an eye out. James said goodbye, returning to his truck. He drove down the dark highway, unsettled. The Redwood Motel was now a storm rider's nest, giving them a vantage point near the interstate. Tomorrow night's delivery could be related to the weapon crates. If he let it slip by, they might expand their operation even further. When he finally got home, it was past midnight. Exhaustion seeped into his bones, but his mind refused to rest. He walked into the workshop one more time, turning on the overhead bulb. The trunk of his old gear remained open, rummaged. He picked up the ballistic vest and tested its weight against his chest. Then he picked up the sidearm, the black metal cold against his skin. No one in Eagle's Rest had any idea who James Cooper used to be or what he was capable of. If they knew, maybe they wouldn't want him around. Or maybe they'd feel safer. But that knowledge cut both ways. If the Storm Riders realized he was more than a simple farmer, they'd come at him with everything they had. Tomorrow night, something big was going down. He could sense it. He needed to be prepared to act. If the law couldn't intervene in time, James might have no choice but to handle it himself. He closed the workshop door, leaving the light on. The orchard and farmland stretched out in the moonlight, deceptively serene. The wind rustled through the trees again, as if whispering that the storm had only just begun. And deep down, James knew, once he crossed the line, once he took up arms to stop these criminals, there would be no easy way to return to the life of a quiet farmer. But if it meant preserving Eagle's Rest, he was ready, even if that meant confronting some unfinished business from his own soul. Morning sunlight found James sitting on his porch, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The adrenaline of the previous night had ebbed, leaving him in a contemplative, weary state. Nevertheless, his mind churned with the knowledge that the Storm Riders planned a meeting this evening. He looked out at his modest farm, a place of tranquility. He pictured the orchard, the barn, the fields he'd so carefully cultivated. He hadn't chosen this town at random all those years ago. He'd come here specifically because it was the polar opposite of his life before. A life of hush-hush missions, calculated risks, and lethal outcomes. And for 8 years, he'd succeeded in leaving that behind until now. By mid-morning, James had made a plan to gather more intel. If the Storm Riders were anything like other criminal outfits he'd encountered, they wouldn't want their business dealings out in the open. That meant they'd meet in a secluded place. The Westbridge warehouse was one option, but they might also choose one of the many abandoned farm properties on the outskirts of the county. He recalled a dilapidated barn off County Road 14, not too far from where the Redwood Motel manager said they'd be heading. He headed into town first to pick up some supplies. As he parked by the local hardware store, yet again he noticed a black SUV idling across the street. The windows were tinted, the engine humming softly. It gave him a bad feeling, but he couldn't be certain it was connected to the Storm Riders. Inside the hardware store, Frank greeted him with a forced smile. "James, thanks for stopping by. You still working on your fences?" "Yeah," James lied smoothly, not wanting to divulge his true intent. "Need a few odds and ends." He grabbed some rope, a flashlight, and a few other items that could come in handy for surveillance. After paying, he stepped outside, scanning the street for the black SUV. It was gone. A chill slithered down his spine. He stowed his purchases and climbed into his truck. As he pulled away, his phone rang again. He recognized the number, Sheriff Thompson. "James, we got another report. The Storm Riders were seen heading down County Road 14 about an hour ago. 5 or 6 of them, plus that utility truck." James tightened his grip on the wheel. "That's near the old Farnsworth property. Abandoned farmstead." "Yeah, it might be a good place for them to meet," Thompson said. "Listen, I'm short on deputies again. We had a break-in on the other side of town, but I'm going to check it out soon as I can." "I understand," James replied. "Thanks for letting me know." He ended the call, heart pounding. They might already be setting up for tonight's deal or scoping out the location. James revved the engine, heading down the main road until he reached the turnoff for County Road 14. Gravel crunched under his tires as he drove along the winding route, farmland on either side. Eventually, he saw the weathered sign marking the Farnsworth property. He parked a good distance away behind a copse of trees, not wanting to announce his arrival. Then, grabbing the items he'd just bought, plus his sidearm, he set out on foot. Quietly, he trudged through the tall grass, taking a circuitous path around the property. The Farnsworth place had been abandoned for over a decade. The main farmhouse stood in disrepair, shutters hanging by a single hinge, windows boarded up. A large barn loomed in the back, roof half collapsed in places. From his vantage point behind a row of bushes, James spotted movement near the barn. Two men in leather vests stood smoking, rifles slung over their shoulders. This was no casual recon. They were armed. Clearly, the storm riders were already positioning guards. He sank lower, staying out of sight. A wave of mixed fear and excitement coursed through him. This was the real deal. He circled quietly, glimpsing a utility truck parked near the barn's entrance. A chain of men was unloading crates similar to the ones he'd seen at Westbridge Warehouse. He counted at least 6 men, including the 2 guards outside. Something told him more might be inside. Their operation was in full swing. The question was whether this was the final handoff or a staging area. Typically, gun-running deals involved external buyers or distributors. James expected to see vehicles from outside the region if a deal was imminent. He didn't see any additional vehicles, though, which might mean the buyers hadn't arrived yet or the storm riders were the ones transporting the weapons out. Regardless, the presence of guards with rifles raised the stakes enormously. James eased away. Staying longer risked detection, and he didn't have enough backup or gear to do anything beyond observing. He retreated to his truck, mind racing with the magnitude of what he'd witnessed. They were armed, organized, and apparently comfortable operating in broad daylight as long as they were out of immediate public view. The Farnsworth property was remote enough that few would stumble upon them. He debated calling the sheriff right away, but Thompson had said he was tied up. Even if the sheriff arrived, how would a couple of deputies handle 6 or more armed men? They could end up in a firefight. Civilians could get hurt. No, that wouldn't do. He decided to return home and plan his next move. Tonight would be critical, he was sure of it. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered overhead, threatening rain. James took it as a sign that the weather might actually help conceal any nighttime operation. He spent the rest of the day mulling over the details, drawing a rough map of the Farnsworth property from memory. He marked entry points, potential vantage points, and cover positions. It felt eerily like old times, preparing for a covert mission. The difference was that now he was operating alone, no team, no command structure, just one man against an unknown force. At dusk, he ate a quick meal and geared up. He donned dark clothing, strapped on a lightweight ballistic vest under a jacket, and holstered his sidearm. He also packed a small pair of binoculars, the rope he'd bought, zip ties, and a first aid kit. The phone was in his pocket with the local sheriff's number on speed dial. If he found the opportunity to gather conclusive evidence, like photographs or even capturing a storm rider for questioning, he would. Driving carefully, headlights off as he neared the property, James parked farther away than before. Darkness wrapped around him as he stepped out, the moon occasionally peeking through breaks in the thick clouds. The wind rustled the trees ominously. He took a wide arc around the farmland, relying on his memory of the day's reconnaissance. He approached the property from the rear, slipping through a broken section of fencing. Each footstep was deliberate, toe to heel, avoiding fallen branches. His heart pounded in his ears. Every sense felt heightened. When he finally reached a line of bushes overlooking the barn, he crouched low and peered through the binoculars. Even in the faint moonlight, he could discern a few figures moving around. Vehicles' headlights periodically illuminated the interior of the barn as bikes and trucks came and went. At least a dozen men now, all armed. Damn, James muttered under his breath. The operation had grown. He risked moving closer to the barn, navigating the tall grass. He wanted to see if there were more crates or if a buyer had arrived. Rain began to sprinkle, little droplets pattering on the leaves, masking the sound of his movements somewhat. As he crept closer, he heard raised voices inside the barn. He managed to position himself near a boarded-up window. Carefully, he pried at a loose plank, creating a small gap. Through that gap, he saw enough to confirm his suspicions. The barn was filled with crates, stacks of rifles, and even some small crates that likely contained ammunition. A man in a biker vest stood talking to a figure in civilian clothes, slacks, a dress shirt, and a leather jacket. The civilian had a slicked-back hairstyle. He wasn't one of the storm riders, he looked more like a cartel representative or a black market broker. The conversation was muffled by the walls and the drumming rain. James strained to catch snippets. The money already transferred, expected more. A partial shipment, next batch arrives. Too risky, local heat is rising. He froze as one of the bikers glanced in his direction. He slowly drew back from the window, holding his breath. If they found him, it would be a shootout. He heard footsteps approaching the barn's wall. Heart hammering, he pressed himself flat against the exterior, hoping the darkness would conceal him. The footsteps paused. James listened, ready to spring into action if discovered. Then the footsteps retreated. Exhaling shakily, James took the opportunity to inch away from the barn. He'd already confirmed what he needed. A major weapons deal was going down. Possibly it was part of a series of transactions. If the buyer was from out of town, that indicated a pipeline to a broader network. This was definitely big enough for federal involvement. The question was how to get the law there in time to catch them red-handed. He circled around, looking for vantage points to photograph the crates. The rain had intensified, making it harder to see and hear. But it also worked in his favor, covering his movements. Finally, he found a vantage near a high window in the barn's back wall from which he might be able to snap a few pictures with his phone. He was about to slip closer when headlights swept across the field, illuminating his position like a spotlight. James dove behind a pile of scrap metal as a pickup truck rumbled up to the barn's side entrance. He waited, silent, until the truck moved inside. The door closed behind it. No immediate alarm had been raised, which meant they likely hadn't spotted him. That was close, too close. He realized his phone battery was low. The cold rain dampened his clothes, seeping into the ballistic vest. He didn't have the ideal tools for nighttime photography. Still, if he could capture just one image of the crates and the men handling them, it might be enough to push the sheriff's department or the ATF to action. Summoning his courage, he slipped along the barn's perimeter until he found a small gap in the boards, waist-high, that offered a limited view inside. James pulled out his phone, set it to silent, and activated the camera. His hands trembled slightly. Lightning flashed far off, illuminating the sky. In that brief moment of light, he saw the glint of rifles stacked on a crate and one of the bikers handing a box to the civilian man. He snapped several photos, not sure if they'd turn out in the darkness. Then he turned to leave. A sudden boom of thunder startled him. The barn door slid open and two men stepped out, shining flashlights into the darkness. James froze. Their beams cut across the muddy ground, searching. One flashlight landed on the scrap metal pile where James had hidden earlier. He crouched even lower, pressing himself into the soggy earth. Rainwater dripped from his hair, beads of moisture clinging to his eyelashes. "We heard something," one man said. Another flash of lightning revealed a storm rider's vest. "Might be just the wind and the storm." "Check anyway," the second man insisted. He moved closer. James's heart thundered. If they found him now, it would be a firefight. A stealth approach was no longer an option. Carefully, James unholstered his sidearm, keeping it ready but pointed downward. He measured his breathing, recalling old training, controlled the adrenaline, maintained clarity. The men came within a few feet. Their flashlights danced across the muddy ground, passing mere inches from James's position. Then one man sneezed, cursed the weather, and turned back. "I'm not seeing anything. Let's head in." They retreated, sliding the barn door closed behind them. James waited a full minute until he was sure they'd gone. Then, moving as quietly as he could on shaking legs, he retreated from the property. Only once he was a safe distance away did he break into a careful run. Each slosh of mud underfoot could have spelled disaster if they heard him, but the storm covered his escape. He made it back to his truck, soaked and shivering, adrenaline surging. He sat behind the wheel, wiping rainwater from his face, phone clutched in his hand. He was in too deep. One false step and the storm riders would kill him without a second thought. He started the truck, headlights still off, and navigated the muddy back roads until he reached the main highway. Then he sped home, occasionally checking the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. Back at the farmhouse, he parked under the carport. Inside, he stripped off his drenched jacket and vest, tossing them onto a chair. He toweled himself off and grabbed a blanket. His phone battery showed 12% remaining. With trembling fingers, he opened the photo gallery to see if any of the pictures were salvageable. He was relieved to find that, despite the darkness, a couple of shots showed clear outlines of men in Storm Riders vests handling what appeared to be rifle crates. One image had a partial face of the civilian buyer, though it was somewhat blurred. Another captured stacks of rifles more distinctly. It wasn't perfect, but it was evidence. James sank onto the couch, hugging the blanket around himself. He felt equal measures of triumph and dread. He had what he needed to blow this operation wide open, but that also meant the Storm Riders would come for him if they discovered who took those photos. If he showed them to the sheriff, it would trigger an immediate crackdown. The bikers, cornered, might retaliate viciously. He set his phone on the coffee table, letting out a shaky breath. His old life had taught him one thing for certain: the greatest risk was doing nothing. Evil flourished when the good stood idle. For all his reluctance to step back into that deadly world, he couldn't let the Storm Riders terrorize Eagle's Rest or funnel weapons into God knows where. He put his head in his hands. Tomorrow he'd show the sheriff everything. Then they'd decide how to proceed. But in the pit of his stomach, he sensed the confrontation would spiral into violence. Maybe, he thought grimly, it was time to call upon the skills he had locked away to protect the innocent and stand against those who threatened the peace. As the storm raged outside, James Cooper, retired Delta Force operator turned humble farmer, realized he was on the edge of a precipice, about to plunge into a battle he couldn't avoid. And he had never felt more alive or more terrified. James Cooper barely slept. Exhaustion threatened to knock him flat, but fear and adrenaline kept his mind turning through the small hours of the morning. He had the incriminating photos stored securely on his phone, images that showed members of the Storm Riders handling crates of illicit rifles, apparently prepping them for sale. Now he needed to decide how and when to share them with Sheriff Thompson. Before dawn, James found himself pacing his living room. The old floorboards groaned with each step, echoing the tension in his head. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, as though counting down the moments to a confrontation he could hardly avoid. Finally, at around 6 in the morning, he grabbed a set of fresh clothes, rechecked the phone to be sure the battery was charging, and steeled himself to drive straight to the sheriff's office. The air was cold and damp from the recent storm as he slipped into the driver's seat of his battered pickup. A lingering drizzle coated his windshield, and the farmland beyond looked ghostly in the early light. The drive into Eagle's Rest was uneventful, no sign of any black SUV or suspicious bikers tailing him. Still, every time a car pulled up behind him, his nerves spiked. When he arrived at the sheriff's office, the receptionist on duty, Deputy Daniels, greeted him with a tired smile. Daniels was a young officer, no more than 2 years on the force. He had sandy blonde hair and wore a constant look of guarded optimism. "Morning, Mr. Cooper," he said politely. "Sheriff Thompson said if you stopped by, you can go right in." James thanked him, walking past the small row of chairs and into Thompson's modest office. He found the sheriff hunched over a map of the county, red circles drawn around certain rural properties, likely spots where the Storm Riders had been spotted. Thompson looked up at James, pushing his reading glasses onto his forehead. "James," he said, voice tight, "I've barely slept. The phone's been ringing off the hook with new complaints. People saw those bikers riding around the outskirts last night, and a few folks think they heard gunshots around the Farnsworth place." "That's what I came to talk about," James said, closing the door behind him. "I was out there. I took some pictures." Thompson's eyebrows shot up. "Pictures?" James explained his nighttime reconnaissance in cautious, deliberate tones. He handed over his phone, showing the blurred, but still damning, images of men in Storm Riders vests handling rifles. Thompson's face went pale as he swiped through each photo. "Good Lord," he muttered. "These are definitely firearms. That's no rumor, they've set up a major operation. This is above my head, James. I'm calling the state police and the ATF. We can't delay." James exhaled. On one hand, relief surged through him that the burden wasn't solely on his shoulders anymore. On the other hand, dread formed in the pit of his stomach. The second the ATF got involved, the Storm Riders would know the law was onto them. They could scatter, hide the weapons, or retaliate viciously against the town. Thompson must have read James's expression because he said quietly, "I know what you're thinking. Once we make these calls, the bikers will be cornered. But we don't have a choice, not if we want to stop them before they flood the state with guns. James nodded, forcing himself to swallow his unease. I agree. We can't let them keep terrorizing people or arming criminals. Thompson picked up the phone, dialing with tense urgency. He left messages with the state police detective he'd spoken with before, then tried a contact at the ATF's nearest field office. The conversation was short. The ATF rep promised to look into it but gave no guarantee of immediate action. Thompson hung up, his face grim. They're stretched thin, the sheriff said. We might get an agent out here to look at the pictures and see if we can get probable cause for a raid, but they won't mobilize a big task force unless they're certain it's a major pipeline. It is, James insisted, recalling the size of the crates. They had an entire barn full of rifles. Thompson grabbed a pen, tapping it anxiously on his desk. We'll do everything we can. In the meantime, I need to keep an eye on those properties and try to get more intel. You're not planning on going out there again, are you? James shifted his weight. I don't want to, but someone has to. If we wait for the feds, the storm riders might move the stash. Thompson's shoulders slumped. He looked at James as though torn between relief that someone was helping and worry that James would get himself killed. If you do, just be careful. I can't officially sanction it, but... I know, James cut in. I'll watch my step. They spoke a little longer, coordinating how they might quietly notify certain residents who lived near Farnsworth's property to steer clear for the next few days. Then James left, stepping back into the overcast morning light. At that moment, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number calling. Apprehension spiked. He slipped into his truck before answering, the door closed for privacy. Hello? A raspy voice responded. Is this James Cooper? James's pulse quickened. Who's asking? The caller gave a low laugh. You're a tough man to find, old buddy. This is Brandon Ellis. Used to run with you in the sandbox, remember? James nearly dropped the phone. Brandon? I tried calling your old number. It was out of service. Yeah, I changed phones a couple times, Brandon said. But I found your voicemail. I kept your name on file from the old days. Sorry for the delayed call, I'm working with the ATF now. James's heart soared. This was exactly who he needed. I'm glad you reached out. I've stumbled onto something big here, an outlaw biker gang, the Storm Riders, stockpiling and selling a huge supply of firearms. Brandon paused for half a second. Storm Riders, he echoed. We've had them on our radar in a few states. We suspect they're part of a larger network. The problem is we never had enough evidence to bust them all at once. James inhaled, the pieces clicking together. I have photos of crates stacked with rifles. They're at an abandoned farm. Sheriff Thompson just called the ATF, but we're worried about a slow response. Brandon's tone sharpened. Email them to me, or if that's not safe, figure out a secure way to send them. I can try to expedite an intervention. But I need to caution you, if you poke the hornet's nest too much, they'll come after you. And from what I hear, they're not amateurs. James grimaced. I know. They've already sent a couple of their guys to my farm. We had words. You okay? Brandon asked, concern edging his voice. I'm fine. But the stakes are rising, James admitted. They won't back down easily. Brandon sighed. I'll do what I can from here. I'm out of state right now, but I might be able to get a small contingent of agents to move on your area if I can prove the threat is real enough. Let me talk to my supervisor. In the meantime, lay low and send me everything you've got. They exchanged temporary contact details and ended the call. James sat in the driver's seat for a long minute, absorbing the relief that he finally had a direct line to someone inside the ATF and not just a random agent on the phone. This might drastically speed up the process. Yet, the question still lingered. Even if Brandon could muster a quick response, would it come in time? He turned the key in the ignition and drove away from the station, deciding to stop by the library. He rarely used email, but he could access a computer there and send the photos to Brandon under the radar. As he pulled into the library's parking lot, he spotted a motorcycle parked across the street, its rider leaning against a lamppost, casually smoking a cigarette. James froze. The man wore a Storm Rider's vest. He parked and got out, pretending not to notice the biker. The man flicked his cigarette onto the asphalt, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. James forced himself to walk calmly, stepping into the library. Inside, the quiet hush of the place clashed with the turmoil in his mind. He found a public computer near the back. The silence was broken only by the hushed whispers of patrons and the soft tap of fingers on keyboards. James logged in as a guest, inserted his phone's memory card into the USB port, and located the images. He typed in Brandon's email address, attached the files, and wrote a short message detailing what the pictures depicted and how urgent the situation was. His palms felt clammy. The presence of a storm rider across the street made him paranoid that at any moment someone might tap him on the shoulder or peer over his head. But no one disturbed him, and after sending the email, he quietly logged out, removed the card, and deleted any trace of his browsing. He left the library with measured steps. The biker was still outside, though now he stood closer to James's truck. James's stomach clenched. He tried to appear nonchalant, walking toward his truck like a man simply going about his business. As he neared, the biker smirked, revealing yellowed teeth. "You sure like poking into things that ain't your concern, farmer boy." James forced a placid expression. "Don't know what you mean." The biker snorted. "We know you've been sniffing around Farnsworth's place. We got eyes in case you haven't noticed." James didn't respond. He simply opened his truck door. The biker put a hand on it, preventing him from closing it once inside. "Don't be stupid," the biker growled. "You're not bulletproof. Neither's this town. Show some respect and maybe you won't end up 6 feet under." Anger surged in James, but he kept his voice calm. "Is that a threat?" The biker leaned in, breath smelling of stale cigarette smoke. "It's a promise." James locked eyes with him, the hint of a cold fury in his gaze. "Then let me make one too. If your gang hurts anyone here, you'll find out some fights aren't worth picking." Something in the biker's expression flickered, a pang of uncertainty at James's confidence. But he covered it with a sneer, stepping back and letting James shut the door. James started the engine, forced himself not to peel out of the lot, and drove away. Through the rearview mirror, he saw the biker mount his ride and follow him at a distance. They were definitely watching him now. James's entire body tensed. If they discovered the evidence he possessed or the calls he was making, their next move might be deadly. He needed to hold out until Brandon or the ATF arrived with enough force to take down the storm riders. As he navigated toward home, the biker trailed him for miles before finally breaking off down a side road. James wondered if they now knew where he lived, if they'd come again in greater numbers with deadlier intentions. His only consolation was that he had some skill in defense and his farm offered plenty of vantage points and cover. By the time he parked beside his barn, a dull ache pounded in his temples. Fear, anger, and frustration warred inside him. He trudged into the farmhouse, locking the door behind him. It felt eerie and too quiet, the hush of impending confrontation weighing on him like an anvil. He checked his phone, no new messages from Brandon or the sheriff. Hours might pass before Brandon got the email or had time to respond. In the meantime, James was on his own. Slowly, methodically, he decided to secure the property. He found old wooden boards to reinforce the windows in the barn in case of a nighttime assault. He took the shotgun from his locked cabinet, loading it carefully with buckshot. The process took him back to field operations he'd run in the Army, fortifying a location, planning fallback positions, anticipating enemy moves. Except this time, the enemy was an outlaw biker gang in rural America. As dusk began to gather, James leaned against the porch railing, scanning the distant tree line. The world around him was quiet, no approaching engines, no shadowy silhouettes creeping through the underbrush. But he knew the storm riders were out there, plotting their next step. He settled in for another long night, every nerve on edge. He had turned an invisible corner in his life, crossing from peaceful farmer to reluctant warrior. The real war was just beginning. Somewhere, in the dark corners of Eagle's Rest, the storm riders were closing ranks, preparing a strike on the quiet man who had dared to uncover their secrets. And James Cooper, battered by fear yet fueled by a deep sense of duty, stood ready to defend the only home he'd ever truly cared about, even if it cost him everything. For the next 2 days, James lived on a knife's edge, waiting for word from Brandon Ellis or from the sheriff about a potential joint operation. Neither arrived quickly enough to ease his anxiety. Meanwhile, the storm riders kept a low yet unmistakable profile. Locals reported seeing them in 2s and 3s at random spots near the gas station, at the edge of farmland, or cruising down deserted back roads. Each report dripped with tension. This gang was firmly staking its claim on the region. Despite the threat, life in Eagles Rest continued. Children still played in schoolyards, farmers still sold produce, and the diner still served hot coffee every morning. Yet, an undercurrent of apprehension threaded through the town. People locked their doors earlier. They traveled in pairs after dark. And James heard whispered conversations about whether they should relocate or sell their properties. The storm riders were behind every fear-laden rumor like a spreading disease. James tried to focus on his usual farm work, tending chickens, maintaining irrigation lines, checking on his orchard. But he couldn't escape the nightmares that began to plague him. Half-remembered missions in faraway deserts, the sound of gunfire echoing against stone walls, and the helplessness he'd felt when an operation went sideways, resulting in civilian casualties. He'd left the army to escape that sense of guilt and loss. Now it threatened to consume him again. Late in the evening of the second day, while he sat at his kitchen table, the phone finally buzzed. The screen showed an out-of-state number. "Heart-pounding," he answered. "Brandon," he said, voice taut with anticipation. "Yeah, it's me," Brandon replied. "I got your email and the photos." "Good work, James." "I showed them to my supervisors. There's definitely enough evidence to start the wheels turning." James felt a spark of relief. "That's great. So, are you sending a team?" A pause crackled over the line. "Here's the issue. We don't have enough manpower in your region at this exact moment. Our nearest ATF field office can't mobilize a full raid for another week due to another high-priority case. Bureaucracy's a mess. I did convince them to send 2 agents to meet your local sheriff in the next couple of days to help plan. But we can't guarantee a large-scale takedown immediately." "A week," James repeated, voice tight with frustration. "They could be gone by then, or they could move the guns somewhere else. They might even escalate violence in town." "I know," Brandon said softly. "I hate it too. Remember, these operations aren't just about one group. The storm riders have ties all over. My boss is pushing for a more coordinated, multi-state takedown. But that takes time. We want to catch them in the act, not just grab a handful of foot soldiers." James ran a hand over his jaw. A dozen scenarios flashed through his mind. None ended well for Eagles Rest if the feds waited too long. The gang's already threatening people. They know I've been snooping. They could strike any day. "Listen, I might be able to get there myself in the next few days," Brandon said. "I'll try to bring a partner or 2 off the books if necessary. But officially, you should keep your head down. Let the professionals handle it when we arrive." James clenched his teeth. The old chain of command still rang in Brandon's voice. But James couldn't ignore what was happening on his doorstep. "I can't just stand by if they move those guns or start hurting people. You know that." Brandon sighed. "I figured you'd say that. But be careful. Look, if you get intel on where they're moving the weapons or who they're meeting, call me immediately. Don't go in alone." With that, the call ended. James stared at his phone, conflicted. The ATF might eventually come through, but eventually could be too late. All the while, the storm riders were running rampant. He left the kitchen to double-check the locks on his doors, a new kind of restlessness gnawing at him. It was time to expand his plan. He found himself returning to the workshop, rummaging through the trunk of his old gear. Inside lay items he'd hoped never to see again: a battered tactical vest with spaces for magazines, a night vision monocular that might still work, and a small med kit from his final deployment. He set them on the workbench, swallowing a rush of emotion. The memories came surging back: comrades lost, civilians caught in crossfire, missions that tested his moral code to the breaking point. The difference now was that he was fighting for his own community, for a place that was supposed to be his refuge. The hard part was ensuring he did it in a way that minimized bloodshed. He flicked on the night vision monocular. The battery still had some charge left. A grainy green hue filled his vision. He tested the adjustments, trying to remember each step. Muscle memory clicked. Before long, the image sharpened. A knock on the workshop door made him freeze. He quickly stashed the monocular in the trunk again. Hard in his throat, he stepped to the door and cracked it open. "James," came a soft, tremulous voice. It was Helen from the farmer's market. She stood in the cool night air, wringing her hands together. Her eyes were wide with worry. "What's wrong?" James asked, stepping aside to let her in. Helen entered, glancing around the workshop as though expecting to see intruders. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm scared. Those bikers, I overheard 2 of them near my house tonight. They were talking about you." James tensed. "Me?" Helen nodded. "They said something like, he's not just some farmer. He's messing with our setup. If he keeps pushing, we'll push back. I got the sense they were planning to come after you." James exhaled slowly, fighting a surge of anger and fear. "Thank you for telling me." Helen pressed a hand to her mouth. "I don't want you to get hurt, but I can't just stand by while they threaten my friend. Should I call the sheriff?" He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'll talk to Sheriff Thompson again. In the meantime, lock your doors and be cautious. Don't go out alone, especially at night." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "James? I don't understand how things got so bad so quickly. This town was always so safe." James wished he had a comforting answer. "Sometimes trouble finds us, even in the quietest places," he said gently. Helen left soon after, and James felt the loneliness of his fight press in more acutely than ever. He imagined how terrified the rest of the town must feel. The Storm Riders were essentially holding Eagle's Rest hostage, an invisible siege powered by threats and intimidation. Trying to steady his nerves, he made a cup of tea and sat at his kitchen table, the steam warming his face. His phone lay next to him. Each time it buzzed, his heart leapt. But no crucial calls came. At last, he trudged upstairs, determined to catch a few hours of sleep. That night, a vivid flashback tore through his dreams. He was back in a conflict zone overseas, crouching behind a wall as bullets whizzed overhead. A group of local civilians was huddled in a bombed-out building, crying out in fear. His squad had orders to extract a high-value target, but the presence of innocent bystanders complicated everything. In the memory, he rushed forward despite the danger, ignoring protocol to shield a young boy cowering in the rubble. The chaotic images spun in a swirl of smoke and dust until he jolted awake, drenched in sweat. For a moment, he stared into the darkness of his bedroom, heart pounding, the echo of gunfire still ringing in his ears. That mission had ended with James's side victorious, but at a cost. Some decisions haunted him. He'd chosen to save civilians rather than follow strict orders, and he was nearly court-martialed for disobeying a direct command. It was one of the catalysts that led him to leave the service. Now, the same moral conviction that drove him then pulled him into confrontation once again. At the break of dawn, he rose from bed, exhausted but resolved. He washed his face, dressed, and ventured outside. The sunrise painted the horizon in delicate pinks and oranges, a deceptive beauty given the tension lurking beneath. He fed his chickens, collected eggs, and watered his vegetables in silence. The routine soothed him until the distant growl of motorcycle engines shattered his focus. James peered down the dirt road. 2 bikes raced past, heading deeper into the rural area. They didn't stop, but the sight brought him little comfort. It meant the Storm Riders were active early, possibly moving contraband or scouting for more vantage points. He placed the eggs in his kitchen, grabbed his keys, and decided to head into town for updates from Thompson. If the Storm Riders were planning something big, maybe the sheriff had caught wind of it. On his way, James passed a battered billboard advertising a local apple festival that had been canceled last year. The paint was peeling, revealing older advertisements beneath. The road was deserted. Then a flash of metal in his rearview mirror caught his attention, another biker. He slowed at the next intersection, noticing the rider mirror his moves at a distance. They were following him again, likely a different member than before. James's pulse quickened. He considered pulling over to confront them, but a direct clash might lead to a shootout. Instead, he kept driving, eventually spotting the outskirts of Eagle's Rest. The bikers stopped trailing once they neared the more populated area, turning down a side street to vanish amid the small grid of residential homes. He parked at the sheriff's office and hurried inside. Thompson was in the lobby, talking urgently with 2 deputies. He waved James over. "We've had 3 calls this morning," Thompson said, eyes shadowed by fatigue. One from a couple that claims they saw a large truck loaded with boxes on the Farnsworth property at dawn. Another from a traveling salesman who said a group of bikers tried to shake him down at the Redwood Motel. and a third from a local rancher who found half his cattle fence cut. James grimaced. They're wreaking havoc. Thompson nodded. We can't pin every incident on them, but it's consistent with the pattern. I've also heard from the ATF. They're sending 2 agents, but not for at least 48 more hours. James's jaw tightened. 48 hours might be too long. I know, Thompson said, rubbing his temple. I'm thinking of organizing a stakeout near the Farnsworth property, but it's risky with limited manpower. If we catch them in the act, we could make arrests, but we'd also risk a shootout. James folded his arms. I might be able to help, at least with reconnaissance. One of the deputies, a Hargrave, who had spoken to James earlier, shifted uneasily. Sheriff, we can't just deputize civilians, can we? Thompson shot him a weary look. We're operating in uncharted territory, Hargrave. I'd rather have backup than walk into a potential war zone blind. They spent the next hour huddled over maps, discussing vantage points. The plan was for Thompson, Hargrave, and another deputy named Celia Alvarez to set up covert observation near Farnsworth's property that evening. James offered to cover the approach from the east side, keeping watch through any vantage he could find. If they saw a large movement of crates or suspicious vehicles arriving, they'd call for immediate backup. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was more than they'd done so far. Thompson insisted they have an escape route ready if the bikers discovered them, because with at least a dozen armed men on site, the deputies might be heavily outgunned. By midday, James left the station to prepare. He needed to gather supplies, night vision gear, a vantage scope if he could borrow one, plus the right clothing to blend into the dark. Before heading home, he stopped by the diner for a quick meal, mostly to see if folks had any fresh rumors. Millie greeted him with subdued warmth, her usual cheer dampened by the town's collective anxiety. The conversation among patrons was hushed, all on the same topic, the storm riders. When he stepped out with a takeaway coffee in hand, James spotted a small note tucked under his windshield wiper. He unfolded it, reading scrawled words that made his blood run cold. Stop meddling or pay the price. Storm riders. So they had no intention of backing off. James felt a storm of emotions coil inside him, anger, fear, and a grim resolve. They might think he was just another civilian they could scare into compliance. They didn't realize they were staring into the face of a retired Delta Force operator who had once bested some of the most dangerous insurgents on the planet. He slipped the note into his pocket, refusing to show fear. As he drove back to his farm, the clouds overhead thickened, mirroring the dark confrontation that seemed inevitable. If the stakeout tonight revealed the storm riders moving their arsenal, there might be no choice but to intervene before they vanished into the night. And if it came to a fight, James wasn't sure how far he'd go or whether he'd emerge from this battle unscathed. But one thing he knew for certain, he would not cower. For the sake of Eagle's Rest, he would stand, alone if he must, against the oncoming storm. The memory of that frightened boy overseas, the choice James made to protect innocence at all costs, still burned brightly in his heart. He would not betray that part of himself, not now, not ever. Night fell quickly, the overcast sky blotting out the moon and stars. Thompson, Hargrave, and Alvarez met James at a secluded spot off a dirt road near the Farnsworth property. They parked their vehicles well out of sight, using tree lines and brush for cover. The air smelled of wet earth, the remnants of that morning's drizzle clinging to everything. James wore dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. He had strapped on a lightweight ballistic vest beneath a black windbreaker, just in case. Hargrave carried a set of binoculars, and Alvarez had a night vision scope borrowed from the county's limited supply of tactical gear. Thompson looked visibly on edge, a pistol holstered at his side and a shotgun lying across the back seat of his cruiser. All right, Thompson whispered once they'd huddled together behind some pines. We'll proceed on foot from here. Alvarez, you take the north edge. Hargrave, you've got the western tree line. I'll be near the southeast corner by the collapsed fence. James, can you cover the eastern side vantage? James nodded, showing them the small, battered night vision monocular he'd brought from his old trunk. I can keep an eye on the barn's main entrance from there. Thompson's jaw tightened. If you see anything suspicious, like a convoy of vehicles or men hauling crates, radio it in immediately. We'll coordinate. But remember, do not engage unless you have to. We're only here for surveillance. James agreed outwardly. Yet in the back of his mind, he knew how quickly only surveillance could turn into chaos when armed criminals were involved. Each deputy had a radio. James had been given a spare handheld unit with a short range. They tested them quickly, hearing faint static. Good enough for a quarter-mile radius in these conditions. They split up, each heading into the darkness. The Farnsworth property lay about 300 yards ahead, barely visible through the stands of trees. James crept along the eastern boundary, carefully avoiding branches that could snap underfoot. Hours of farm work had not dulled his old training. If anything, the recent tension had sharpened his senses, reminding him how to move stealthily under low light. He found a slight rise in the land that offered a decent angle on the large barn. The structure had a few floodlights mounted on the exterior, likely installed by the storm riders for night work, so it stood out like a dull glow in the gloom. The wide barn door was partially open, and James could see silhouettes moving around inside. He raised the monocular, peering through a green-tinted lens. Sure enough, crates were being moved. 4 or 5 bikers in vests walked back and forth, occasionally pausing to converse or smoke. A battered SUV was parked near the entrance, trunk open. James counted at least 8 men outside, plus more unseen within. Even from a distance, he could sense their tension. They were preparing for something, perhaps a shipment or a buyer's arrival. He keyed the radio softly. "This is James. I see multiple individuals at the barn. No vehicles arriving yet." A burst of static, then Thompson's voice came through. "Copy that. Keep watch." Minutes stretched into an hour. The men inside the barn continued shifting boxes, occasionally stopping to argue. The faint crunch of gravel or the roar of a distant motorcycle broke the silence every so often. James's heart thumped in his ears, every muscle tensed. He'd been in stakeouts before, but never as a civilian volunteer, never with so little backup. Another half hour passed. Still no sign of a convoy or buyers. The bikers seemed restless. One man emerged, lighting a cigarette, scanning the tree line as though suspecting watchers. James froze, keeping his head low. The man's flashlight probed the darkness briefly but settled back on the barn door. Then, around midnight, James heard it, an engine rumble growing louder. He peered into the night vision lens, spotting a pair of headlights bouncing down the dirt road on the far side of the barn. Someone was arriving. He radioed in the update, voice hushed but urgent. "Vehicle inbound from the north. Looks like a pickup truck." Thompson responded, "I see it from here. Everyone, hold position." The pickup parked near the barn. 2 figures stepped out, one wearing a storm rider's vest, the other in plain clothes. The plainclothes individual had a distinctive limp. He leaned on a cane as he walked, a strange sight among these rough bikers. They exchanged a few words. A burly biker gestured to the barn. Then all 3 men disappeared inside. Minutes later, the barn lights grew brighter, as though someone flipped additional switches. Movement spiked. The men carried boxes to the bed of the pickup. James snapped pictures with his phone, hoping the lens would catch enough detail in the low light. The radio crackled with sporadic updates from Thompson and the deputies, each confirming the new arrival. Suddenly, the radio hissed with static and Hargrave's frantic whisper, multiple bikes approaching from the west. "Looks like 4, no, 5 bikes. They're heading to the barn." James's pulse ratcheted higher. This was it, a gathering of storm riders. Could this be the final step before they transported the guns elsewhere? He felt an urge to move closer, but that would be reckless. The plan was strictly to observe. He pressed the radio button. "I see some lights. Everyone hold tight." The 5 bikes arrived in a thunder of engines, cutting them off once they reached the barn's perimeter. One man hopped off, gesturing emphatically. More crates got shuffled around. A line of men formed, passing boxes from the barn interior into the pickup. James counted at least 15 men now, not including the driver of the first SUV. That was far more than the sheriff's tiny crew could handle alone. For a time, the movement of crates continued smoothly. James captured several pictures of the line of men transferring what appeared to be weapon boxes. Then a heated argument broke out. Raised voices tore through the night air, though James couldn't make out the words. One voice in particular bellowed curses as he kicked a crate, sending it spilling to the ground with a metallic clatter. Rifles or parts must have fallen out because the men scrambled to pick them up. James's radio burst with Thompson's voice, now taut with alarm. "They're loading guns into that pickup. We can't let them leave with that shipment." Hargrave chimed in, "Sheriff, we're outnumbered. We'd need a SWAT team." A tense silence followed, then Thompson replied, "I know. But if they drive off, we might lose them for good. They could distribute those guns anywhere, another state, a different hideout." "Alvarez, what's your position?" Alvarez spoke quietly, north side, maybe 150 yards from the barn. "I have a partial view. I can try to disable the truck's engine with a shot, but that could spark a firefight." James felt his stomach twist. This was the nightmare scenario, escalation without backup. They had no one else to call. The nearest full SWAT team was hours away, and the ATF agents were days out. If they let that truck leave, all the evidence might vanish. If they intervened, it could become a bloodbath. He pressed his own radio. "Sheriff, if we do nothing, they vanish. If we strike, we risk a shootout. Is there a middle ground?" Thompson's reply crackled. "I'm thinking we might puncture the truck's tires quietly, buy time until more help arrives. But that means someone has to get close." The prospect of sneaking onto the property with 15 armed bikers was daunting. James's mind spun. He had done stealth infiltrations in war zones, but never alone and never with so little gear. Yet, he couldn't shake the memory of what was at stake. These firearms could flood the underworld, fueling violence across multiple states. And the Storm Riders, who had already terrorized Eagle's Rest, would feel unstoppable if they pulled this off. "I'll do it," James said before he could talk himself out of it. "I'll circle around, come up on the east side near the truck. Let me see if I can slash the tires or disable the engine. Just be ready to cover me if things go wrong." A tense pause. Then Thompson replied, "God help us." "All right, but don't get yourself killed. We'll create a small distraction if needed." Without another word, James pocketed the radio, adjusted his vest, and rose to a crouch. The night vision monocular guided him through the darkness as he kept well beyond the circle of the barn's floodlights. Every step felt heavier than the last, the damp grass and leaf litter muffling his footfalls. He slipped around the orchard behind the Farnsworth house, now just a rotted skeleton of wood and broken windows. From there, he saw the pickup, engine running, men occasionally tossing boxes in from the barn. They were busy, which might give him a window to act. He counted shadows, approximating guard positions. 2 men lingered by the SUV, another 2 near the barn door. The rest bustled around the truck, cursing and barking orders. Rain began to drizzle again, the patter on the barn's tin roof masking the sound of James's approach. He crouched low behind a stack of rotted pallets about 30 feet from the truck. Close enough? He could smell the exhaust fumes, see the glow of red taillights. He fished a utility knife from his pocket, the blade glinting in the meager light. The idea was to move swiftly between the rear wheel wells, slash the tires, and then scramble back to cover. If discovered, he'd have to rely on the darkness and confusion to slip away, assuming they didn't open fire immediately. He sucked in a breath, heart hammering so loudly he feared they'd hear it. Then, with a silent prayer, he darted out from behind the pallets and dove under the truck's chassis. The engine's growl vibrated through the metal. Gravel crunched under his knees. He kept perfectly still, listening to the scuff of boots on the other side. One man spat on the ground, cursing about the weather. James extended his arm, reaching the knife toward the rear driver's side tire. He punctured it quickly, hearing a soft hiss of escaping air. Next, the passenger's side rear tire. Another hiss. If he stopped there, the truck might still be driven, but not well. The front tires were riskier, men were stationed near the hood. But James resolved to try. He shimmied forward, sliding his body under the axle. The rainwater mixed with dirt, turning everything muddy. He managed to reach the front passenger's tire, slicing a deep gash along the sidewall. The hiss was louder this time. He froze. A biker's footsteps crunched closer. The man muttered something about hearing a noise. James willed himself to become invisible in the darkness. His legs twitched with the urge to move. Then the man stepped away, evidently distracted by another shout from the barn entrance. James seized the moment to slash the final front tire. A triumphant hiss. The pickup now had 4 soon-to-be flat tires. He carefully slid back toward the rear. Suddenly, the interior barn lights blazed brighter, illuminating the ground around the truck. One of the bikers in the pickup's bed stomped his foot and demanded a flashlight to check the cargo. James pressed himself against the chassis, not daring to move. He breathed in short, controlled bursts. Seconds ticked by like hours. The men argued about how to stack the crates. Another demanded they hurry up because of the increasing heat from local law enforcement. Slowly, James began to retreat, sliding on his belly out from under the truck. Mud coated his arms and vest, but he didn't care. All he wanted was to get back behind those pallets. He almost made it. Then a flashlight beam swept the ground, catching a flicker of movement. A startled voice barked, "What the hell? Someone's under the truck." James's chest seized. Adrenaline exploded through his veins. He hurled himself into a roll, darting out from beneath the vehicle just as the flashlight pinned the spot he'd occupied. Shouts erupted, heavy boots pounding. A bullet whizzed past, cracking into the gravel. James sprinted for the pallets, zigzagging to make himself a harder target. Chaos erupted behind him. The roar of angered voices, the staccato blasts of gunfire. He dove behind a rusted tractor frame near the pallets, hearing bullets ping off metal. His radio crackled with Thompson's frantic voice. "Shots fired! Shots fired! Everyone fall back!" James pressed the transmit button, panting. "I'm pinned near the truck's east side. They spotted me. Tires are slashed, though." Through the swirl of panic, he recalled the plan: do not engage unless absolutely necessary. They were outnumbered. The storm riders wouldn't hesitate to kill. Hargrave and Alvarez might be able to lay down covering fire, but a prolonged shootout could lead to multiple casualties. He peered around the tractor. The pickup's rear tires were visibly deflating. One of the bikers knelt beside the truck, rifle in hand, scanning the darkness with a flashlight. Another sprinted toward the open barn door, presumably to warn the others or fetch more guns. The entire operation was unraveling in real time. A fresh burst of bullets whined overhead. He ducked, heart pounding. Then Thompson's voice crackled on the radio. "We're pinned too. They've got rifles. We only have sidearms. James, can you slip away?" James clenched his teeth, scanning for an escape route. The orchard was about 50 yards to the east, offering cover. If he sprinted, he might make it. But the rifles had serious range. He braced himself, adrenaline coursing. He clicked the radio. "I'll try." On 3, laid down fire toward the barn. "I'll break for the orchard." "Copy," Thompson's tense voice replied. James tightened his grip on his sidearm. He wasn't here to kill anyone, but he needed to survive. At Thompson's shouted "now," a few gunshots sounded from the deputies' positions. The storm riders near the barn ducked behind crates, returning fire in that direction. It was James's chance. He bolted from behind the tractor, footsteps thundering across muddy ground, arms pumping. He half expected a bullet to catch him in the back. Gunshots rattled the night, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness like miniature thunderclaps. He reached the orchard's perimeter, diving behind a row of overgrown bushes. A bullet smacked into the bark of a tree nearby, sending splinters flying. Another whizzed overhead with a terrifying crack. James crawled deeper into the orchard, breathing in sharp gasps. The radio crackled. Alvarez spoke, voice trembling with urgency. "Sheriff, they're coming our way. We need to retreat." Overwhelmed, Thompson cursed audibly. "Everyone fall back to your vehicles. We'll regroup at the old service road. James, can you link up there?" James forced out, "Yes, go. I'll circle around. Keep your headlights off." The orchard provided enough concealment for him to slip away. He lost track of how many bikers were firing or how the other deputies managed to escape. The night turned into a maelstrom of shouting, sporadic gunfire, and pounding heartbeats. In the distance, an engine roared, perhaps one of the bikers' vehicles giving chase to the retreating lawmen. Eventually, James reached the fence line, hopped over, and found himself back on the rural road. His truck was parked a few hundred yards away. He sprinted there, hands shaking uncontrollably. He started the engine, flipped off the headlights, and rolled down the gravel track. His radio was silent, no sign of Thompson or the others. Fear gnawed him. He had no idea if they'd made it out safely. At last, as he neared the rendezvous point, a wooded clearing off the main road, he saw a lone set of headlights flashing in the dark. It was Thompson's cruiser. Hargrave's patrol car was behind it. Both looked battered but intact. James parked beside them, stumbling out of the truck. Thompson, Hargrave, and Alvarez emerged, faces pale. Alvarez had a bleeding scrape along her forearm but otherwise looked uninjured. Thompson exhaled with visible relief upon seeing James. "Thank God. We thought you might be dead." James swallowed. "I'm all right. Are you three okay?" Hargrave let out a shaky laugh. "We're alive, but that was close. They're heavily armed. At least we might have slowed them down tonight." "True," Alvarez said. "That truck's not going anywhere fast on 4 flat tires." James nodded, wiping sweat and rain from his face. "We can't go back there without a real tactical team." Thompson ran a hand over his drenched hair. "I'll radio the station, get more units to lock down the roads. But we won't push it. We need to wait for the feds." They all stood in stunned silence, the enormity of the situation settling over them. The storm riders had opened fire with lethal intent. The tension had escalated into a full-blown firefight. And though James managed to disable the truck, the gang wasn't likely to forget or forgive the sabotage. If anything, they doubled down on revenge. As the four of them stood in the flickering glow of the cruiser's headlights, James felt the weight of what he'd done. He'd brought the fight to them, risking lives on both sides. Yet letting that truck roll away with crates of weapons would have doomed countless others. Right or wrong, the line had been crossed. They packed up and headed back toward Eagle's Rest, battered but alive. In the hush of the dark roads, none of them spoke about what might come next. But James sensed they all felt it. The storm riders wouldn't let this humiliation slide. Retaliation was inevitable. And as he drove, James couldn't shake the sinking feeling that he had just ignited a fuse leading to a far more explosive conflict, one that would test every bit of his training and moral resolve. Early the next morning, James half expected to find a small army of bikers on his doorstep looking for blood. But the dawn came and went without incident. Perhaps they were recovering from the chaotic night at Farnsworth or maybe regrouping. Whatever the reason, the lull felt ominous. Sheriff Thompson called at 9, his voice hoarse. "I spent half the night dealing with the aftermath. No bodies found, but we found shell casings all over the property. Seems the storm riders cleared out after we left. The pickup was still there with 4 flat tires, but the crates were gone." James exhaled sharply. "They moved them quickly." "Yeah. Probably had enough men and vehicles to relocate the guns somewhere else," Thompson said, frustration seeping through his words. "No sign of them in Farnsworth's barn this morning. They vanished into the night." James sank onto his porch chair. "They won't give up. Not when they can stash those weapons somewhere else." "Agreed," Thompson said. "I put out a notice for all local law enforcement to watch for suspicious trucks or vans. Still no guarantee we'll catch them. Any word from that ATF contact of yours?" "Not yet," James replied grimly. "He said he'd try to come in person soon, but it could still be days. Then we keep our guard up. I'll try to maintain a police presence around town, but we're spread thin." As James hung up, he scanned the horizon, expecting any moment to see columns of smoke or hear the roar of motorcycles. Instead, he heard only the distant crow of a rooster, the rustle of wind through the orchard. It was a deceptively tranquil morning, belying the violence that lurked just out of sight. He busied himself with farm chores, feeding livestock, checking the orchard for storm damage, and repairing a broken gate. The routine offered some semblance of normality, though every unexpected sound made him tense. In the late afternoon, he took a moment to reflect, leaning on the fence by his orchard. He found himself thinking about Eagle's Rest, the neighbors he cared about, the children who deserved a safe home, the small businesses that thrived on local trust. This was his community now. No matter what it took, he had to protect it. He decided to drive into town for a quick supply run. On the way, he saw remnants of the storm riders' influence, graffiti tags on an abandoned gas station, small clusters of locals whispering anxiously on street corners, and boards hastily nailed over broken windows in the Redwood Motel office. Signs of intimidation and petty vandalism, yet nothing that revealed the gang's current whereabouts. At the hardware store, Frank greeted James with a haggard nod. "You holding up, James?" "Trying to," James replied, noticing how jumpy Frank seemed. "You okay?" Frank wiped sweat from his brow. "Can't sleep at night. Afraid the bikers might come tear my place apart. Heard they shot at you and the sheriff last night." James forced a calm tone. "We're doing what we can. They're on the run, I think." Frank didn't look reassured. "Let's hope they stay gone." He paused, then added quietly, "Ever think about leaving town till this blows over?" James shook his head. I can't do that, Frank. Frank sighed but said no more. He rang up James's supplies, just some nails and a new padlock. James had decided to reinforce the barn door at his farm. As he stepped outside, the early evening sun cast long shadows across the street. Every shape felt threatening. He scanned for any sign of watchers or lurking bikers, seeing none. By the time he returned home, a voicemail notification lit up his phone. He listened, Brandon Ellis's voice, urgent but steady. James, I'm on my way. I'll be in your area tomorrow afternoon. Bringing one other ATF agent. Unofficially, I'd like to meet you outside of town, away from prying eyes. Call me back with a location. And James, stay safe. We're close to pulling the trigger on a coordinated approach, but it's not official yet. Hope soared in James's chest. Help was finally coming, albeit only 2 agents. Still, Brandon was a trusted friend who knew James's background and could coordinate with the main ATF office. If they played their cards right, they might stop the storm riders from scattering or harming more innocent people. James called back, leaving a message suggesting they meet at an old roadside diner about 10 miles out of Eagle's Rest. It had long since closed, but the parking lot remained a good spot for a discreet rendezvous. That night, James tried to rest, but images of the Farnsworth shootout haunted him. He wondered how many times he'd have to face the storm riders before it ended. If they moved those weapons to another location, would the fight spread beyond Eagle's Rest? He drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming again of war zones and half-forgotten screams. In the dream, he stood in the middle of a burning town, alone and surrounded by faceless adversaries. When he woke, drenched in sweat, the moonlight filtered through his window like a silent accusation, reminding him that in the real world, he might soon face an even more terrifying scenario. At dawn, he took a call from Sheriff Thompson, who reported no major overnight incidents, just scattered sightings of individual bikers. Possibly the storm riders were licking their wounds or reorganizing. James informed the sheriff that 2 ATF agents would arrive soon, but asked him to keep that intel quiet. The fewer who knew, the better the chance of surprising the gang. By midday, James set off for the deserted diner. The air felt stifling as the sun reached its zenith, the humidity clinging to his skin. The old diner sat near a junction that once connected major highways, but it had been bypassed years ago when the roads were rerouted. Now it lay in cracked concrete and weeds. He parked in the back, out of sight from the main road. Half an hour later, a dull gray SUV pulled in, the dust plume swirling behind it. 2 men stepped out. One was Brandon Ellis, taller than James remembered, with closely cropped hair now streaked with a bit of gray at the temples. He wore casual clothes but moved with the crisp efficiency James recalled from their Delta Force days. The other was a lean man with dark hair, presumably the ATF partner. James walked over, hand extended. Brandon. His old comrade broke into a grin and clasped James's hand firmly. Good to see you, brother. Wish it was under better circumstances. The other man nodded curtly. I'm Agent Willis. Heard a lot about you, Mr. Cooper. James shook his hand. Just call me James. They quickly retreated to the shade behind the diner, the sun beating down on the cracked asphalt. Brandon wasted no time. All right, give us the latest. The photos you sent, the shootout, fill in the gaps. James recounted everything, the farmers' market harassment, the infiltration at Westbridge warehouse, the Farnsworth stakeout, and the scuffle that ended in gunfire. Brandon and Willis listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The tension in their faces grew. Willis whistled low when James described the sheer number of crates. That's a serious shipment. Enough to supply a small militia. Brandon nodded. We've suspected for a while that the Storm Riders are more than just a local gang. They have ties to larger trafficking circles. The biggest challenge is that they're transient, moving contraband across different counties and states. If we can pin them down here with the firearms, we could break a critical link in the pipeline. James glanced around, wary of any watchers. The sheriff only has a handful of deputies. They're brave, but outgunned. We need a plan that doesn't rely on them storming a heavily armed hideout. Brandon exchanged a look with Willis. We're off the official radar right now. Our boss doesn't want to authorize a full raid until a bigger net is ready. But Willis and I can provide specialized support. We have some gear in the SUV. Surveillance equipment, unmarked guns, bulletproof vests. Willis nodded. We can also coordinate with local law enforcement quietly, gather more evidence, and set a trap. If we can lure the storm riders into a single location with the bulk of their weapons, we might contain them. James's thoughts flicked to the Redwood Motel, Farnsworth's Barn, and Westbridge Warehouse. They keep shifting stash sites. Right now, they might be using yet another abandoned property. We can't be sure. Brandon glanced at James. That's where your local knowledge and your, unique skill set comes in. You're a farmer, but we both know you have eyes like a recon scout. If you help us spot their new hideout, we can plan an ambush. It'll be surgical, fast, precise, minimal collateral damage. A swirl of old pride and new dread spun inside James. He'd done recon missions countless times, but this was home turf. He had more to lose if things went wrong. Yet, if it prevented widespread violence and ended the Storm Riders' reign of terror, it might be worth the risk. He nodded slowly. All right, I'll do it. But we have to be careful. These men won't hesitate to kill if cornered. Willis placed a small digital device in James's hands. This is a secure channel radio with better range than what the sheriff gave you. Use it if you find their location. Brandon and I will be nearby, ready to move. They continued strategizing for another half hour, the sun scorching overhead. Brandon showed James a set of small binoculars with thermal imaging capabilities more advanced than James's old monocular. They discussed possible abandoned properties around Eagle's Rest. One area stood out, a defunct trucking depot near a train track on the eastern edge of the county. It had been shuttered for years and it offered multiple loading docks, perfect for quickly moving crates into trucks or freight cars. Before departing, Brandon gave James a firm handshake. We'll keep a low profile so the Storm Riders don't realize federal agents are here. Reach out once you have something. James watched them drive off, the SUV blending into the highway traffic. Hope kindled in him. Brandon Ellis was no stranger to high-stakes operations. If anyone could tilt the odds, it was him. He too set off toward Eagle's Rest, mind churning with possibilities. The trucking depot felt like a prime candidate for the gang's next big move, especially if they planned to relocate the stolen guns out of state. But simply walking in for a look could be deadly. He'd have to be cunning, leveraging his knowledge of the terrain and his old infiltration skills. Yet, even as he steeled himself for the next step, James couldn't shake the apprehension that overshadowed every plan. The Storm Riders were ruthless, armed to the teeth, and likely furious about having their operation disrupted. If James misstepped, it wouldn't just be him at risk, it could drag Brandon, Willis, the sheriff, and innocent bystanders into a war zone. As he drove back toward the farm, he recalled an old saying from his Delta days: confidence is silent, insecurities are loud. Right now, his insecurities roared like thunder in his mind. But he swallowed them, remembering that he had once walked through worse danger and emerged alive. Whether fate or coincidence, he was uniquely suited to safeguard this town. He parked his pickup in front of his barn, stepping out into the late afternoon light. The wind rustled through his orchard, carrying the scent of ripening apples. It reminded him that, even amid all the chaos, life went on. Farmers tended crops, families shared meals, and children laughed in backyards. The stakes were clear: if he failed, that precious peace could be shattered indefinitely. And so, with renewed determination, James Cooper prepared to once again become the soldier he had tried so hard to leave behind. That evening, James readied himself for another infiltration, this time targeting the old trucking depot on the eastern edge of the county. He loaded the advanced binoculars and the secure radio from Brandon into a discreet backpack. Slipping on dark clothing and sturdy boots, he felt that old tension coil in his muscles, the electric charge of a mission about to begin. Before leaving, he texted Thompson a simple note: checking the old depot tonight. Will advise. He didn't want a large police presence that might tip off the gang, but he also couldn't go in completely alone. Thompson replied with a thumbs-up emoji, likely meaning he'd be on standby if James needed an emergency rescue. The road to the depot wound past farmland and a couple of rundown warehouses. It was well after dark, the moon half hidden by drifting clouds. A low fog settled across the fields, blurring the edges of James's headlights. He turned them off well before reaching the depot, parking in a ditch behind a row of scrubby trees. The structure lay a quarter-mile away, just a vague silhouette in the gloom. Sliding out quietly, he slung his backpack over one shoulder and began the slow trek. The night air felt cooler than usual, each breath tinged with a hint of autumn. Occasionally, he heard a distant train horn echo through the county, a lonely sound that heightened the sense of isolation. As he approached, he used the advanced binoculars to scout from a safe distance. The trucking depot was a sprawling complex of concrete loading bays, old trailers, and a rusted chain-link fence. Faded signs on the side of the building read Eagle Logistics in peeling paint. Several of the large garage doors had been boarded up or left to rot, but one near the back appeared to have been forced open recently. A faint light glowed inside, likely a portable lamp or flashlight. James's heart thudded. If the storm riders were holed up here, it would explain the quiet near Farnsworth's place. He circled carefully, stepping over broken concrete chunks and twisted rebar. The entire facility smelled of decay and dust, punctuated by the tang of old motor oil. Finally, he found a vantage point behind a stack of abandoned shipping pallets about 50 yards from the open door. He lifted the binoculars again, switching to thermal imaging. The lens displayed faint heat signatures. Sure enough, half a dozen shapes moved around inside, a group of men, some carrying what looked like long metal objects. Rifles, almost certainly. James counted at least 7 distinct heat signatures. More could be out of range. He keyed the secure radio, whispering, "Brandon, can you hear me?" Static, then a soft reply, loud and clear. "Go ahead. I'm at the old depot. I see at least 7 men inside, possibly armed with rifles. That's all I've got so far." Brandon's tone sharpened. "Copy that. We're only a few miles away. Willis and I will head in your direction, keep a low profile. Don't do anything risky." James exhaled, eyes never leaving the suspicious shapes in the binoculars. "Understood. Hurry." He stashed the radio in a side pocket. For the next 10 minutes, he watched as men came and went inside the depot's cavernous space. Now and then, a figure ambled to the open door and peered out, scanning the darkness. James held his breath each time, convinced they might notice him. But the partial cloud cover and sparse lighting seemed to cloak his position effectively. Suddenly, the faint roar of motorcycle engines drifted from the distance. James tensed. Moments later, 2 headlights cut through the fog, drawing up to a side gate of the depot. The bikes paused and the men inside opened the gate. The riders drove in, headlights briefly illuminating the interior. James caught a glimpse of crates stacked along a far wall, each marked with stenciled numbers, likely indicating their illicit contents. The 2 bikers dismounted. One was tall, with an unmistakable black beard, the same man James had fought with in his barn. A jolt of adrenaline coursed through him. The man was alive and well, apparently leading or at least participating in the depot operation. Another figure stomped out to greet them, shaking hands. They spoke animatedly, though James couldn't hear them from this distance. He fiddled with the binoculars, zooming in on the crates. Even in the dim interior light, he saw the outline of rifles when one of the men lifted a lid. He snapped a few photos using his phone's camera through the binocular lens, hoping they'd be clear enough. More evidence for the ATF. A tingle of apprehension crept along his spine. If they moved these crates tonight, the trail might go cold again. Brandon and Willis would need to arrive soon if they wanted to catch them. James considered calling the sheriff, but he remembered how outnumbered the deputies had been last time. Then the radio crackled softly, Brandon's voice cutting through. "James, we're at the perimeter. About 200 yards west of your position. We see activity at the depot fence." James scanned the fence line. Sure enough, a faint shape, a man with a rifle, stood guard at a small booth that used to be a security post. "I see him," James whispered. "One guard. Possibly more inside." "Understood," Brandon replied. "We might slip closer to get vantage. Stand by." The next few minutes felt like an eternity. James tried to slow his breathing, every sense prickling with the awareness that a single mistake could result in a gunfight. On a whim, he tested the thermal binoculars in another direction, scanning the perimeter of the depot. He picked up a flicker of heat behind a row of rusted shipping containers. Another guard crouched, likely watching the approach from the main road. The storm riders had grown cautious. He reported the second guard to Brandon and waited. Meanwhile, the men inside the depot continued rummaging through crates. James was too far away to catch specific words, but their posture seemed tense, as if they were preparing for a major move. At last, the radio hissed again. "James, we see a path on the west side leading to a side entrance. We can probably slip in and see what's going on. If we confirm the guns are here, we'll call for local backup." James frowned. The suggestion of Brandon going inside alone worried him. He pressed the transmit button. "They're well-armed, man. If you get cornered." Brandon's voice was calm. "Willis and I have done plenty of these ops. We'll be careful." A spike of old camaraderie tugged at James. Brandon was as trained as he was, maybe more. Still, the Storm Riders had numbers. He swallowed, reminding himself that Brandon wasn't a novice. "All right. I'll keep eyes on the main door." "Copy," Brandon replied. "We're moving now." James watched through the binoculars as two faint shapes, presumably Brandon and Willis, skirted the fence, hugging the shadows. Their approach was methodical. Meanwhile, the tall bearded biker stepped outside for a smoke, scanning the yard. A minute later, Brandon and Willis disappeared from James's view, presumably slipping around the corner of the depot. Tension coiled in James's gut. If something went wrong, he would have to create a distraction to help them escape. He checked the phone, no new messages. The night air felt electric, a hush broken only by the occasional clang of metal or rumble of a distant train. Inside the depot, the men continued their work. James counted at least 10 figures now, some in Storm Riders' vests, others in plain clothes. He recognized the limp of the man from Farnsworth's barn, leaning on a cane. Possibly the buyer or an intermediary. They seemed to be finalizing some sort of deal. He glimpsed money exchanging hands in the form of thick envelopes. Suddenly, yelling erupted from the far side of the building. Lights flickered and men rushed to the side entrance, rifles at the ready. James's heart thundered. Had Brandon and Willis been spotted? Gunfire split the air, a short, staccato burst followed by angry shouting. "Brandon?" James hissed into the radio. No response. A wave of bikers poured out of the building, heading to the west side with weapons drawn. James realized with horror that if Brandon and Willis were cornered, they'd be grossly outnumbered. Mind racing, he considered a desperate measure. He could open fire from his vantage to divert attention, but that might expose him entirely. Alternatively, he could call in Thompson immediately. He chose the radio first. "Sheriff, it's James. Shots fired at the depot. Agents might be compromised. Please send backup." No immediate reply. Possibly Thompson was out of range or his radio was off. James cursed under his breath. Another flurry of shots came from inside. The men in the yard were shouting, half of them sprinting toward the building's interior, the rest spreading out around the perimeter. James's chest tightened, time to act. He rose to a crouch and circled wide, slipping along the chain-link fence. If he could cause enough confusion, maybe Brandon and Willis could slip away. He found a spot where the fence was cut, presumably from some earlier trespass. Slipping through, he crept behind a row of toppled concrete barriers. His sidearm felt heavy at his hip. Near the western entrance, muzzle flashes lit the gloom. He glimpsed a figure in tactical gear, likely Willis, firing short bursts to keep the bikers at bay. Another figure was crouched behind an overturned steel drum, possibly Brandon. Shouts indicated that the Storm Riders were trying to flank them. James forced his breathing into a calm rhythm. He was outnumbered, but stealth and surprise were on his side. He scrambled onto an old loading platform, moving across the catwalk that overlooked the courtyard. From there, he spotted a pair of bikers creeping around a shipping container to ambush Brandon's position. James leveled his pistol, heart pounding. He'd never fired a gun in his new life outside the army. The moral weight of it felt crushing, but letting Brandon be gunned down wasn't an option. He fired 2 quick shots, the muzzle flashes blinding in the darkness. One biker dropped with a pained cry, the other dove for cover, returning wild shots. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off the steel catwalk. James dropped flat, chest hammering. He'd revealed his position, but he'd also stalled the ambushers. More Storm Riders turned their rifles upward, peppering the catwalk with automatic fire. James crawled behind a rusted girder, bits of metal and dust raining down on him. A wave of dizziness washed over him. He was pinned. He radioed in a shaky whisper. "Brandon, can you move? I'm drawing fire." Brandon's voice crackled back. "I see you up there." Good timing. We'll fall back to the side door, cover us if you can. James blinked sweat from his eyes, taking a quick peek. Brandon and Willis were retreating, trying to exit the courtyard. He forced himself to breathe, then popped up to return fire, aiming low to keep the bikers' heads down. The echo of gunshots reverberated across the depot. Some bikers scattered behind crates, others advanced in bursts, unleashing suppressive fire. One bullet slammed into the girder near James's face, showering him with rust flakes. Brandon and Willis made it to an exit, but another cluster of storm riders cut them off, forcing them back inside. James cursed, checking his magazine. He had only a few rounds left. The storm riders, with their crates of guns, wouldn't be short on ammo. He needed a way to create a massive diversion. He spied an old forklift parked near the building. If he could get to it, maybe he could ram it into something flammable or block a key access point. It was a wild idea, but desperation fueled him. He holstered his pistol and slid off the catwalk, landing hard on the pavement below. Pain shot through his ankles, but he gritted his teeth and sprinted for the forklift, hunched low. Bullets danced around him, pinging off the concrete. He reached the forklift's cab, breath ragged, hands shaking as he turned the ignition. Incredibly, the engine coughed to life. It must have had just enough juice. The forklift's headlights flickered on, illuminating a group of bikers. They yelled, one of them opening fire. A bullet shattered the windshield, glass spraying across the seat. James ducked, slamming the accelerator. The forklift lurched forward, smashing through a stack of empty crates. He swung the steering wheel, causing the metal forks to scrape the ground with a ghastly screech. One biker dove aside, another fired wildly but missed. The forklift plowed into a large steel container with a resounding clang, toppling it. Thunderous noise reverberated, capturing everyone's attention. In the confusion, Brandon and Willis bolted from the side entrance, guns raised. They fired controlled bursts at the startled bikers, driving them into disarray. James kept the forklift moving, pivoting to block off the main exit path. It was a crude but effective barrier. "James, come on," Brandon shouted, gesturing for him to jump down. James abandoned the forklift, rolling across the pavement as more bullets whizzed overhead. He scrambled to join Brandon and Willis, reloading his pistol with the spare mag from his pocket. Together, the three of them retreated behind a parked trailer for cover. "They have a full arsenal in there," Brandon said between gasping breaths. "We counted at least 12 men. Might be more." Willis nodded, reloading his own weapon. "We're pinned down. Another wave is circling around." James peeked around the edge of the trailer, seeing muzzle flashes from multiple directions. The storm riders had effectively surrounded them. There was no sign of the sheriff's backup. The situation was dire. They could try to fight through, but with so many armed gang members, the odds were slim. Then, amid the frenzied gunfire, James noticed a faint red glow in the distance. Headlights, multiple sets. Could it be the sheriff? Or more bikers? Brandon cursed under his breath, likely seeing it too. "We can't handle more hostiles. We need an exit." James's radio suddenly sparked to life. "James? This is Thompson. We're inbound 8 units with lights off. Hang tight." Relief and dread flooded James simultaneously. 8 units might tip the scale, but also risked a wide-open shootout. Still, it was better than being trapped. "Sheriff," James hissed into the radio, "they're heavily armed. Approach with caution." Moments later, the hum of engines filled the air. Several patrol cars swung into the depot yard, spotlights flicking on. Deputies took cover behind their doors, weapons drawn. The storm riders, caught between the forklift blockade, the 3 armed men behind the trailer, and the sudden arrival of law enforcement, began to panic. Some fired at the cruisers, bullets smashing into windshields and hoods. Others tried to dash for a side fence. Thompson's voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "Drop your weapons. This is the sheriff's department. Stand down." In response, gunfire lit the night. The storm riders were not surrendering. James, Brandon, and Willis had a chance now, though the bikers' focus had shifted to the new threat. With a shared glance, the 3 men scrambled along the side of the trailer, circling to flank the gang's position. They emerged near the forklift wreckage, seeing half a dozen bikers pinned down by the sheriff's spotlights. Another group, maybe 5 or 6, was crouched behind crates, trading fire with the deputies. The man with the black beard barked orders, fury etched on his face. Brandon shouted, "ATF. Drop your weapons," as he, Willis, and James pressed forward. A few bikers turned, eyes wide. One tossed his rifle aside, raising his hands. Another tried to run, only to be tackled by Willis. The bearded biker recognized James. A twisted grin spread across his face. "We should have killed you at your barn," he snarled, raising an AK-47. James fired first, 2 shots center mass. The man staggered backward, dropping the rifle. Blood bloomed on his vest as he collapsed. James's stomach lurched. He had just ended a life, or at least gravely wounded someone. But there was no time for reflection. Another biker swung a shotgun toward them. Brandon put him down with a crisp 3-round burst. In seconds, the fight turned as more deputies rushed in. A few bikers managed to hop the fence and vanish into the darkness, but the rest were pinned or wounded. Thompson himself approached cautiously, shotgun raised. One by one, the storm riders either surrendered or lay incapacitated. The depot fell silent except for the hiss of punctured tires and the groans of injured men. Some of the crates had been riddled with bullets, their contents, assault rifles and ammunition, spilled onto the concrete floor. It looked like a war zone in miniature. James slumped against a battered shipping container, chest heaving. Brandon placed a hand on his shoulder, eyes filled with both relief and concern. "You okay, brother?" James wiped sweat from his brow, voice tight. "I will be." Willis knelt nearby, helping cuff a biker who was still conscious. Deputies fanned out, clearing the area, checking for stragglers. It was over for now. But the adrenaline still surged through James's veins, and the weight of having fired a lethal shot pressed on his soul. Thompson approached, eyes scanning the carnage. "We got a couple that ran, but we captured most." "Looks like you took out their ringleader," he said quietly, glancing at the bearded man on the ground. Medics were already leaning over him, though he appeared unresponsive. James nodded numbly. He didn't feel any triumph, just a profound exhaustion. This was the cost of standing up to dangerous men. Yet, the threat to Eagle's Rest was largely contained. The Storm Riders' stockpile was in police custody, many of their members arrested or injured. The pipeline had been severed here. Brandon turned to Thompson. "We'll coordinate with the ATF. This is a major weapons cache. If we process it right, we can lead the feds to the higher-ups behind these shipments." The sheriff nodded, relief etched on his face. "Thank you. We couldn't have done this alone." And James, he met the farmer's gaze, swallowing hard. "We owe you more than we can say." James stood, forcing a thin smile. "I just did what I had to do." Yet, as the medics wheeled the wounded away and deputies began cataloging the seized weapons, James felt a hollow ache inside. He'd fought to protect his town and stop dangerous criminals, but violence left scars on both victors and the defeated. He wondered if he could truly return to a peaceful life after all this. For a moment, he gazed at the orchard beyond the depot's fence, the rolling farmland that stretched toward Eagle's Rest. He'd saved those fields from the shadow of a criminal empire, but the cost weighed heavily on him. Brandon gave him a small nod of understanding, as if reading his thoughts. "Sometimes it's the quiet people who carry the heaviest burdens," he said softly. James nodded. "Yeah," he whispered. "Sometimes it is." A swirl of police lights bathed the depot in red and blue, marking the end of one battle and the beginning of James Cooper's uncertain road back to normalcy. Eagle's Rest was safer, but James's war within himself would linger, haunting him like a quiet echo long after the last siren faded away. In the weeks that followed the dramatic raid at the old trucking depot, Eagle's Rest slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. Word spread that the Storm Riders had been dealt a crippling blow, their local leadership decimated, their major weapons stash seized, and many of their members facing serious felony charges. A few stragglers who'd escaped into the night were rumored to be on the run in other states. For James Cooper, life was both the same and irrevocably changed. The orchard still needed tending, the chickens still needed feeding, and his produce stands still waited for him at the weekly farmer's market. But he carried within him a sharper awareness of life's fragility and a heavy sense of responsibility for the violence he had unleashed. Each morning, he'd wake before dawn, often troubled by dreams of gunfire and desert battlefields blending with the cacophony of that final firefight at the depot. He'd make himself coffee, step out onto the porch, and remind himself that he'd acted in defense of his neighbors. The guilt did not vanish, but it eased knowing he had prevented greater harm. The sheriff's department was hailed as local heroes in the county paper, though Thompson made sure to mention James's role. The article called him an unlikely protector, a farmer who had stood up to a ruthless gang. Some residents looked at James with newfound admiration. Others, uneasy about the violence, kept a cautious distance, sensing the dangerous capabilities that lay behind his gentle exterior. Helen, the vendor from the farmer's market, visited James one afternoon to bring him a freshly baked pie. Her hands trembled as she extended the gift. "We all heard how you risked your life." "Thank you, James." He accepted the pie, feeling a pang of emotion. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad nobody else got hurt." She managed a small smile. "We're lucky to have you here." After Helen left, James couldn't help but notice the bullet holes still marring his old barn door from the earlier scuffle with the two bikers. He'd patch them eventually, but for now, they were a reminder of how close danger had come to his doorstep. Brandon Ellis and Agent Willis, meanwhile, coordinated closely with federal authorities. They took statements, cataloged evidence, and tracked the origin of the captured weapons. Their efforts pointed to a larger interstate trafficking ring, which now had a gaping hole where the Storm Riders' local operation used to be. A couple of weeks after the raid, Brandon visited James at the farm one final time before heading out of state on another assignment. They walked through the orchard, sunlight filtering through the leaves. Brandon studied the rows of apple trees, the neat lines of vegetables, the clucking chickens nearby. "It's peaceful here," he said quietly, stopping to pick up a fallen apple. "Hard to believe how much violence touched this place." James nodded, arms folded. "I tried to keep it out, but trouble has a way of finding its way in." Brandon turned to him, expression solemn. "You did a good thing, James. We might have taken down a significant part of the trafficking network because of you. A lot of lives will be safer." James offered a faint smile. "I appreciate that, but it doesn't erase what happened." Brandon nodded understandingly. "Combat never really leaves you. But you've also proven something to yourself. You're still the guy who saves people, not the one who runs away." They shared a firm handshake, a silent exchange of respect and camaraderie. Moments later, Brandon drove off, leaving James alone amidst the gently swaying orchard. In the quiet aftermath, James found himself at a crossroads. He'd been forced to reveal a part of himself he'd tried to bury. Neighbors who once saw him as just another friendly farmer now looked at him like a mysterious figure. And though he felt uneasy about the attention, he also sensed a subtle shift in his own spirit, a reminder that he could protect what he loved, even if it meant stepping into the shadow of his past. He channeled his energy into rebuilding and healing. He repaired the barn door, repainting the wood and making it sturdier than before. He added a security system to his workshop, not wanting to be caught off guard again. He spent long days in the fields, coaxing life from the soil, finding solace in the simple rhythms of planting, watering, harvesting. The sheriff's department quietly kept an eye out for any storm riders who might seek revenge, but weeks passed without incident. Many of the gang's rank and file were behind bars, awaiting trial on weapon trafficking charges. The once feared presence of roaring motorcycles diminished, replaced by the typical hum of small-town life. One autumn morning, as James loaded crates of produce into his old pickup for the farmer's market, he felt a surprising sense of normalcy. The sun gilded his fields, and crisp air hinted at the coming harvest season. He still bore the scars of what had happened physically and mentally, but the weight grew lighter each day. At the market, Helen flagged him down, a bright smile on her face. "James, you brought apple preserves again, I hope?" He laughed softly. "Sure did. Let me grab you a jar." She followed him to his stall, where other neighbors gathered, greeting him warmly. The chatter was about harvests, recipes, local gossip, life as usual in Eagle's Rest. It struck James how adversity had drawn the town closer. People who might have once taken their safety for granted now valued each other more. As he handed Helen the jar, a voice behind him asked, "Excuse me, sir, are you the farmer who stood up to those bikers?" James turned to see a young man, maybe in his 20s, wearing a ball cap and a backpack slung over his shoulder. He seemed awestruck. "I just moved here from a few towns over," the newcomer continued. "Heard stories about how you protected this place." James felt a flush creep into his cheeks. "I had help," he said, trying to deflect the admiration. "The sheriff's department and the feds did most of the work. But still, the young man insisted it must have taken a lot of courage. "Thank you for saving our town." James gave a polite nod, not quite sure how to respond. He'd lived through extremes, from war zones to farmland, and always felt uneasy about being labeled a hero. "Just looking out for my neighbors," he finally said, turning back to adjust some produce on his stall. He went about his day, selling vegetables, chatting with customers, and offering gardening tips to a couple who wanted to start a small backyard farm. The hum of conversation and the pleasant mingling of scents, fresh bread, flowers, and newly cut herbs felt like a balm on his soul. The town he loved was safe again, thriving in its modest way, and he was part of its fabric. In a quiet moment, James glanced at the horizon. He thought of the photograph in his bedroom showing his old Delta Force team. He recalled missions that haunted him, the friends he'd lost, the moral struggles he'd wrestled with. And now, bridging that past and his present, he found meaning in the idea that protecting innocent lives was never truly behind him. It was a calling he couldn't escape. But maybe that was okay. Maybe he could find peace in combining the best parts of both worlds, the soldier who defended others and the farmer who nurtured life from the earth. A breeze rustled the market stalls, carrying laughter and the promise of a bright day. James smiled to himself, the tension of recent weeks finally giving way to a hopeful acceptance. Life in Eagle's Rest would never be the same, yet perhaps it could be even stronger for having faced its trial. As for James, he would carry on tending his land, sharing its bounty, and quietly standing ready should danger ever return. Because beneath the worn overalls and extra weight, he was, and always would be, a protector. And in that moment, he felt the stirrings of true peace in his heart, grateful for a second chance at a life where the seeds of hope could grow tall under the warmth of a safe and lasting sunrise.